In the stillness before dawn they appear, silhouettes against the mist moving like ghosts across the golden valley, hooves barely disturbing the earth beneath them. Five wild spirits led by a stallion darker than midnight, and following them a child who hasn't spoken in 93 days. Some wounds run too deep for words to reach. Some truths can only be witnessed by those who speak without language. Some connections transcend the barriers we build between species. In Whisper Valley, the locals watch from their porches each morning as Emma Harper leads her silent procession through town. They leave gifts along the path: warm tea, knitted blankets, freshly baked bread. Is it pity that moves them, or recognition of something ancient and profound? What does a 7-year-old who has lost everything know that the rest of us have forgotten? And what happens when the only witness to an unspoken truth is a horse with eyes that see too much? This is a story of silence, of healing, of a voice that needed no words to be heard. The valley awakened slowly. Tendrils of mist hovered just above the ground, dancing between stalks of golden grass that stretched toward the horizon. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the haze, casting long shadows across Whisper Valley. As if summoned by the dawn itself, they appeared dark silhouettes emerging from the mist. Mustangs. A dozen strong, they moved as one body hooves, barely disturbing the earth beneath them. Their leader, a powerful black stallion with a jagged white blaze down his face, paused at the crest of a hill. His ears flicked forward, nostrils flaring as he sampled the morning air. Behind him, the herd waited, steam rising from their backs in the cool autumn air. This was Montana at its most primal, wild horses against an endless sky, mountains standing sentinel in the distance. But this morning, like every morning, for the past 3 months, the horses weren't truly wild. They had a destination. Eagle Rock Ranch sat nestled against the foothills, its weathered barn and modest farmhouse, a stark contrast to the untamed beauty surrounding it. The corral fence leaned slightly, the white paint peeling in places. A windmill creaked nearby, spinning lazily in the gentle breeze. It wasn't grand or impressive, but it was home. Inside the farmhouse, tiny feet padded across worn floorboards. Emma Harper stood on tiptoes to peer out the kitchen window, her breath fogging the glass. Though only 7 years old, her eyes held a depth of understanding that belied her age. Her dark hair, uncombed and wild, framed a face still soft with childhood, but marked by something else, something no child should know. Loss. Outside, the horses were approaching. Emma's breath quickened, her small hands pressing against the window. The black stallion led the way, his powerful stride purposeful as he brought the herd to the edge of the property line. There they stopped as if waiting. Margaret Harper appeared in the doorway, her silver hair pulled back in a loose bun. Deep lines etched her face, evidence of both laughter and grief. She moved slowly, arthritis making her joints stiff in the morning chill. "They're here again," Margaret said, more to herself than to the child. Emma didn't respond. She hadn't spoken a word in 3 months, not since the accident. Not since the night the rain fell in sheets across the windshield, the headlights cutting through the darkness until another set of lights appeared, too close, too fast. Not since the sound of metal crushing metal had been the last thing she heard before silence claimed her world. Margaret watched her granddaughter carefully. The doctors had explained that Emma's muteness wasn't physical, her vocal cords were undamaged. The trauma had simply stolen her voice along with her parents. The same doctors had also noted signs of mild autism spectrum disorder, explaining Emma's intense focus on patterns and her difficulty connecting with people since the accident. But with the horses, that was different. "Your grandfather's making pancakes," Margaret said, keeping her voice light. "Blueberry ones, your favorite." Emma didn't turn around. Her attention remained fixed on the horses, particularly on the smallest one, a dappled gray mare with gentle eyes. Willow. The mare had belonged to Emma's mother, Sarah. Now, like Emma herself, Willow belonged nowhere and everywhere. In the adjacent room, Walter Harper worked at the stove, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he flipped pancakes. At 72, his once broad shoulders had begun to stoop, but his movements were still precise, deliberate. A lifetime of ranching had made him strong, even as age tried to claim that strength back. "She watching them again?" he asked when Margaret entered. Margaret nodded, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Every morning, same time. They come, she watches. It's like they have an appointment." Walter grunted, sliding another pancake onto the growing stack. "Storm knows what he's doing. Smartest horse I ever saw? Sarah always said he could practically read her mind. The mention of their daughter's name hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken grief. They'd lost their only child and her husband Michael in that crash. Now all they had left was Emma and the 5 horses that had once been Sarah and Michael's pride and joy. Helen called again, Margaret said quietly so Emma wouldn't hear. Says the town council's meeting today. Some folks are concerned about wild horses roaming so close to town. Walter's jaw tightened. Nothing wild about them. They're just doing what they always did, grazing the south pasture in the morning, coming back to the north field by evening. Been doing it for years. Next, but now there's no fence keeping them in, Margaret reminded him. And you know how Helen gets. Helen Whitmore had been the school principal when both Sarah and later Michael had attended Whisper Valley Elementary. Now retired, she devoted her considerable energy to town affairs. She'd never approved of the Harpers' approach to horsekeeping, believing the animals should be properly contained. Helen can mind her own business, Walter muttered. We've got enough to worry about. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Margaret turned just in time to see Emma slipping outside, still in her pajamas, her feet bare against the dewy grass. Emma, Margaret called, but the child was already halfway to the horses. Walter set down his spatula. Let her be, Maggie. They won't hurt her. Through the window they watched as Emma approached the herd. Most people would be afraid to walk straight up to a group of semi-wild horses, but Emma showed no fear. The black stallion Storm lowered his massive head as she drew near. Emma reached up her small hand, touching his velvety muzzle. One by one, the other horses moved forward. Thunder, a chestnut gelding with a fiery temperament. Dawn, a placid Palomino mare. Dusty, a curious young buckskin who always seemed to find trouble. And finally Willow, who pushed past the others to nuzzle Emma's shoulder. It's like they're protecting her, Margaret whispered. Walter nodded, his eyes misting slightly. Sarah would be glad of that. Outside, Emma stood surrounded by horses much larger than herself, yet perfectly at ease. For the first time that day, a hint of a smile touched her lips. Dr. Elena Reyes pulled her truck into the gravel driveway of Eagle Rock Ranch later that morning. As the only veterinarian in Whisper Valley, she'd been caring for the Harper horses for years. But since Sarah and Michael's deaths, her visits had taken on a new purpose. She found Walter in the barn measuring out feed. Morning, Walt, she called. How are they doing today? Walter straightened slowly, one hand pressing against his lower back. About the same. Storm's keeping them in line. Emma was out with them at dawn again. Elena nodded, setting her medical bag on a hay bale. At 38, she had the confident posture of someone comfortable with animals, and the thoughtful eyes of someone who preferred them to most people. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her jeans and flannel shirt were worn but clean. I've been documenting their behavior, she said. The way they interact with Emma, it's remarkable. I've never seen anything quite like it. Sarah always said Storm was special, Walter replied, pride evident in his voice. Smart as any human, she'd say. Elena smiled. I believe it, but it's more than that. It's almost like they formed a kind of therapy circle around her. The way they position themselves, the way they seem to understand her needs without any verbal commands. Natural horse sense, Walter said with a shrug. They know she's hurting. It's more scientific than that, Elena insisted gently. There's growing research about equine therapy for trauma and autism spectrum disorders. What's happening with Emma and these horses, it's exactly what specialized treatment centers try to create. But this is happening organically. Walter looked skeptical. Fancy words for saying horses make her feel better. Elena laughed. Essentially, yes. Where is she now? With Margaret in the kitchen. Doctor's appointment in town today. Elena's expression grew serious. Have you heard anything about the council meeting? Walter's face darkened. Helen's stirring up trouble again. Says the horses are dangerous roaming free like they do. They're not exactly roaming free, Elena pointed out. They stay within the old property boundaries. They just don't have a fence forcing them to anymore. When Sarah and Michael died, the Harpers had been forced to sell off most of their land to cover medical bills and funeral expenses. All that remained was the house barn in about 5 acres. The horses technically had no legal claim, to the 100 acres they still grazed upon, most of which now belonged to the county or private owners who hadn't yet developed their parcels. "Try telling Helen that," Walter muttered. "She's got half the town convinced Storm's going to trample some child." Elena sighed. "I'll speak at the meeting. As a professional, I can attest to the therapeutic benefit these horses are providing Emma. And I'll emphasize that they pose no threat." Walter nodded gratefully, then glanced toward the house. "What about Emma? Any progress with her speaking?" "These things take time," Elena said gently. "The trauma she experienced losing both parents being in the car during the crash, it's not something a child simply gets over. Her mind is protecting itself. By not talking, by retreating to where it feels safe. Right now, that safe place doesn't include verbal communication." Elena placed a hand on Walter's shoulder. "But she's connecting with the horses. That's a huge step. Many trauma survivors can't connect with anything at first." Walter looked down, blinking rapidly. "Margaret and I, we're not young anymore. We're doing our best, but sometimes I wonder if it's enough." "It is," Elena assured him. "Emma needs stability and love. You're providing both." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a sleek silver car pulling into the driveway. Helen Whitmore stepped out, her posture rigid, her gray hair cut in a severe bob that framed a face set in perpetual disapproval. "Speak of the devil," Walter muttered. Elena squeezed his shoulder once more before dropping her hand. "Let me handle this." Helen approached, her heels inappropriate for a ranch clicking against the gravel. At 65, she carried herself with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. The death of her husband 5 years prior had only hardened that demeanor. "Walter," she acknowledged with a curt nod. "Dr. Reyes." "Helen," Elena replied coolly. "What brings you out to Eagle Rock today?" Helen's gaze swept the property, noting the peeling paint and sagging fence. "I wanted to speak with you before the council meeting, as a courtesy." Walter crossed his arms. "Courtesy would be minding your own business." Helen's lips thinned. "When it affects public safety, it becomes everyone's business. Those horses were spotted on Main Street yesterday. What if a child had been hurt?" "They were following Emma and Margaret back from the doctor's office," Elena explained, keeping her voice level. "They maintained a safe distance the entire time. I was there." "This time," Helen countered. "But what about next time, or the time after that? Those animals are unpredictable." "They're not," Walter insisted. "Storm keeps them in check. Has for years." Helen's expression softened slightly, though the change seemed calculated rather than genuine. "Walter, I understand this is difficult. Sarah loved those horses, but you must consider what's best for Emma and for the community." "Those horses are what's best for Emma," Elena interjected firmly. "They're providing therapy no doctor could replicate." Helen raised an eyebrow. "Are you qualified to make that assessment, Dr. Reyes? You're a veterinarian, not a child psychologist." Before Elena could respond, the barn door creaked open. Emma stood there watching them with wide, solemn eyes. Margaret appeared behind her, one hand protectively on the child's shoulder. "Helen," Margaret said, her voice cool. "We weren't expecting you." Helen's demeanor changed instantly, a smile appearing that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Margaret, lovely to see you. And Emma, my, how you've grown." Emma took a step back, pressing against her grandmother's side. "We were just discussing the council meeting," Helen continued smoothly. "I wanted to assure you that my concerns are purely about safety, nothing personal." Margaret's grip on Emma's shoulder tightened slightly. "The horses aren't dangerous, Helen. They never have been." "Perhaps not intentionally," Helen conceded, "but accidents happen. And with Emma's condition, she might not be able to call for help if something went wrong." At the mention of her condition, Emma's expression closed further. She turned and walked back toward the house, her movements deliberate, shoulders hunched. Margaret watched her go, then fixed Helen with a steely gaze. "I think you should leave now." Helen sighed dramatically. "I can see this isn't productive. I'll see you all at the meeting this afternoon." She turned to go, then paused. "Oh, and Walter, you might want to fix that fence before someone gets hurt." They watched in silence as Helen returned to her car and drove away, dust billowing behind her tires. "That woman," Walter growled once she was gone, "always poking her nose where it doesn't belong." Margaret shook her head. "She's afraid of what she doesn't understand." Always has been. Elena picked up her medical bag. I'll head into town now. Get prepared for the meeting. Don't worry too much. The council is generally reasonable. As Elena drove away, Walter and Margaret stood side by side, watching the dust settle on the road. We can't lose those horses, Margaret said quietly. They're all that's keeping Emma connected to the world. For Walter took his wife's hand, his weathered fingers entwining with hers. We won't lose them, I promise. Inside the house, Emma sat by the window watching the horses grazing in the distance. Her small hand traced patterns on the glass circles and lines that seemed random, but followed a rhythm only she understood. In her other hand, she clutched a faded photograph of her parents, both smiling, both standing beside Storm, their pride evident in their posture. Emma's world had shrunk to this house, these grandparents, these horses. The thought of losing any piece of it was more than her young mind could bear. The town hall of Whisper Valley was filled to capacity that afternoon. Wood paneling covered the walls and hard wooden benches lined the room. At the front, 7 council members sat behind a long table, their expressions varying from concern to bored. Walter and Margaret sat in the third row, Emma between them. The child's eyes darted around the room, taking in the unfamiliar faces, her discomfort evident in the way she twisted the hem of her dress. Dr. Elena Reyes sat directly behind them, offering a reassuring smile whenever Emma glanced back. Helen Whitmore sat in the front row, a folder of papers neatly arranged on her lap. She spoke quietly with the council president, occasionally gesturing toward the Harpers. More townspeople filed in, some nodding sympathetically to Walter and Margaret, others avoiding eye contact. Whisper Valley was a small community of just over 3,000 people, and everyone knew the Harper tragedy. Opinions on the horse situation, however, were clearly divided. Mayor Jenkins, a balding man with kind eyes, called the meeting to order. Today we're addressing concerns raised by several citizens regarding the horses formerly owned by Sarah and Michael Harper, now under the care of Walter and Margaret Harper. These horses have been observed moving freely through town and surrounding areas. Helen Whitmore has submitted a formal request for the council to intervene. Helen stood smoothing her skirt. Thank you, Mayor Jenkins. My concerns are simple. These 5 horses, particularly the stallion known as Storm, pose a potential danger to our community. They follow the Harper child around town, they cross private property without permission, and they have no proper containment. She opened her folder, removing several photographs. These were taken last week on Main Street. As you can see, the stallion is displaying aggressive behavior toward a passerby. Now, the photos were passed to the council members. From where Walter sat, he could see they showed Storm, with his head lowered, ears, pinned back, defensive posture, not aggressive, but most people wouldn't know the difference. What Helen fails to mention, Walter said loudly, without waiting to be called upon, is that the passerby was trying to approach Emma without permission. Storm was protecting her like he's always done for our family. Mayor Jenkins frowned. Mr. Harper, please wait to be recognized before speaking. Helen continued as if there had been no interruption. Furthermore, the Harpers no longer own sufficient property to legally maintain 5 horses. Town ordinance requires 1 acre per horse for proper keeping. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Walter's face reddened, and Margaret placed a restraining hand on his arm. The ultimate concern, Helen finished, is for Emma herself. A child in her condition, unable to speak, showing signs of developmental issues, should not be left in a potentially dangerous situation with inadequate supervision. At this, Walter stood abruptly. Now wait just a minute. Walter, Margaret warned, tugging his sleeve. Mayor Jenkins banged his gavel. Mr. Harper, please take your seat. You'll have your turn to speak. Walter sat reluctantly, his jaw clenched. Emma beside him had gone very still, her eyes fixed on her shoes. Dr. Reyes, the mayor continued, I believe you wish to speak on this matter as well. Elena stood, her posture professional, but her eyes flashing with barely contained anger. Yes, thank you. As the veterinarian who has cared for these horses for the past 8 years, I can state unequivocally that they pose no threat to public safety. Storm in particular is exceptionally well-trained and intelligent. She turned to face the audience rather than just the council. But more importantly, these horses are providing invaluable therapeutic benefits to Emma Harper. As many of you know, Emma hasn't spoken since the accident that killed her parents. She shows signs of post-traumatic stress disorder, and possibly mild autism spectrum disorder. Elena gestured toward Emma, who shrank further into her seat. Her connection with these horses, particularly with Willow and Storm, represents her primary engagement with the world right now. The rhythm and routine of caring for them, the nonverbal communication they share, these are crucial elements in her healing process. A woman in the back raised her hand. Dr. Reyes, are you qualified to make psychological assessments? I thought you were a veterinarian. Elena nodded. You're right, I'm not a child psychologist. But Emma's actual psychologist, Dr. Chen from Missoula, has reviewed my observations and supports my assessment. She couldn't be here today, but has submitted a letter to that effect. She handed a document to Mayor Jenkins, who skimmed it briefly before passing it to the other council members. The fact remains, Helen interjected, that those horses are technically trespassing every day. They no longer have legal access to the land they're grazing. Sheriff Dobson, a tall man with a weathered face, spoke up from his position near the door. If I may, Mayor, no property owner has filed a trespassing complaint. In fact, the Williams family and the Peterson estate have both given verbal permission for the horses to continue grazing their undeveloped parcels. Helen's lips thinned in displeasure. An elderly woman stood slowly from her seat near the front. Molly Carpenter had owned the town's only diner for over 40 years and was respected by everyone. I'd like to say something if I may. Mayor Jenkins nodded. Go ahead, Molly. I've lived in this valley my whole life. She began, her voice surprisingly strong for her 80 years. Seen a lot of changes, some good, some not so good. But one thing that's always made this place special is how we take care of our own. She turned to look directly at Helen. Those horses aren't hurting anyone. In fact, they're the one bright spot in that poor child's life right now. Every morning, Emma leads them through town, and do you know what happens? People come out of their houses to watch. They leave apples on their fence posts. Mrs. Garcia knits small blankets for Emma. The Johnsons leave hot tea on their porch for Walter and Margaret. Molly's gaze swept the room. That procession has become a symbol of healing for this entire town, not just for Emma. We all lost Sarah and Michael. We're all grieving. Those horses remind us that life goes on, that beauty still exists. A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Helen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Thank you, Molly, Mayor Jenkins said when she finished. Walter, Margaret, would you like to speak? Margaret nudged Walter, who stood slowly, his hand remaining on Emma's shoulder. Those horses belong to our daughter and son-in-law. They're all Emma has left of her parents. They're all we have left too. His voice broke slightly. We're doing the best we can. If we could afford to rebuild the fences, we would. If we could buy back the land we had to sell, we would. But we can't. He looked down at Emma, whose eyes remained fixed on the floor. These horses understand Emma in a way none of us can right now. They're helping her heal. Please don't take them away from her. She's lost enough already. The room fell silent when Walter finished speaking. Even Helen seemed momentarily subdued. Mayor Jenkins cleared his throat. Thank you all for your input. The council will take a brief recess to discuss this matter. We'll reconvene in 15 minutes. As the council members filed out, the room erupted in hushed conversations. Margaret leaned over to Emma. Would you like to go outside for a bit? Get some fresh air? Emma nodded, sliding off the bench. As they made their way toward the door, Sheriff Dobson approached them. Walter, he said quietly, just want you to know I'm on your side in this. Those horses aren't causing any trouble. Walter nodded gratefully. Appreciate that, Jim. The sheriff lowered his voice further. But you should know Helen's been making calls to Child Protective Services, asking questions about Emma's living situation. Margaret's hand tightened on Emma's shoulder. She wouldn't. She would, the sheriff replied grimly. Just a heads up. Might want to make sure everything at the ranch is ship-shape just in case they come looking. Outside, Emma broke away from her grandmother and walked to the edge of the town square. As if summoned by her presence, the 5 horses appeared at the far end of Main Street, Storm in the lead. They moved at a walk, maintaining a respectful distance from pedestrians and parked cars. People stopped to watch them, smiling, others frowning in concern. Emma stood very still, her eyes locked with Storm's across the distance. The big stallion nickered softly, a sound meant just for her. Helen emerged from the town hall, saw the horses, and immediately pulled out her phone to take pictures. This is exactly what I'm talking about, she said loudly to anyone who would listen. Wild animals roaming our streets. Dr. Reyes, who had followed the Harpers outside, stepped forward. They're hardly wild, Helen. They're simply checking on Emma. Watch. Emma raised her hand slightly palm out. Storm immediately stopped the other horses, halting behind him. When she lowered her hand, the stallion backed up 3 steps, then turned the herd around. They retreated to the edge of town where they remained grazing peacefully on the public green. That child has more control over those horses than most professional trainers I've seen, Elena said pointedly. There's nothing dangerous about this situation. Helen sniffed dismissively. It's only a matter of time. Mark my words. Back inside the town hall, the council members returned their expressions grave. Mayor Jenkins called the meeting back to order. After careful consideration, he began, the council has decided to take the following action regarding the Harper horses. Walter and Margaret Harper will be granted a 6-month grace period to either construct proper fencing for their current property or make other arrangements for the horses. During this period, the horses may continue to graze on the previously agreed upon properties provided written permission is obtained from all landowners. Walter exhaled slowly. 6 months wasn't much time, but it was something. Additionally, the mayor continued, Storm must wear a tracking device provided by the sheriff's department to monitor his movements. If at any point there is an incident involving the horses that threatens public safety, this arrangement will be immediately reconsidered. Helen stood abruptly. This is completely inadequate. What about the child's safety? Mayor Jenkins frowned. Ms. Whitmore, the council finds no evidence that Emma Harper is in any danger from these animals. On the contrary, Dr. Chen's letter makes a compelling case for their therapeutic value. Helen began. The council's decision is final, the mayor said firmly. This meeting is adjourned. As people began to file out, Walter and Margaret shared a look of cautious relief. 6 months wasn't a permanent solution, but it gave them time. Emma, however, was focused on something else entirely. Walter was rubbing his left arm, his face pale and drawn. Before anyone could react, Emma tugged urgently on Dr. Reyes' sleeve, pointing at her grandfather. Elena looked at Walter sharply. Walt, are you okay? Walter waved dismissively. Just a little indigestion. Been happening on and off today. But Emma's expression was insistent. She tugged harder on Elena's sleeve, then made a quick gesture toward her own chest, mimicking pain. Walter, Elena said, alarm creeping into her voice. How long has your arm been hurting? It's nothing, Walter insisted, but Margaret was already reaching for her phone. I'm calling an ambulance, she said firmly. Outside, Storm suddenly raised his head, nostrils flaring. He let out a shrill whinny that echoed through the town square, causing several people to turn in alarm. The stallion pawed the ground, his attention fixed on the town hall. Inside, Walter finally admitted, maybe sitting down would be good. He lowered himself onto a bench, his breathing labored. Chest feels tight. Emma broke away from her grandmother and ran outside. Those watching saw her approach Storm, who lowered his head to her level. The child placed her hands on either side of the horse's face, their foreheads almost touching. It was a moment of connection so profound that even Helen Whitmore fell silent, her phone halfway to her ear. When the ambulance arrived 10 minutes later, the paramedics confirmed what Emma had somehow known: Walter was having a mild heart attack. As they loaded him into the ambulance, the entire town seemed to hold its breath. Margaret climbed in beside her husband, promising Emma they'd be back soon, that Grandpa would be fine. Sheriff Dobson placed a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. I'll stay with her until you get back, he assured Margaret. As the ambulance pulled away, its sirens wailing, Emma stood in the town square. 5 horses lined up behind her like silent guardians. The sight was so striking that several people took pictures, capturing the moment when a mute child and her horses became something more than just a local curiosity. They became a symbol of something the town desperately needed: hope in the face of tragedy, connection in the midst of loss. Helen Whitmore watched from the steps of the town hall, her expression unreadable. Around her wrist, she twisted a red leather bracelet, a nervous habit she'd developed in recent years. As the horses shifted position, Storm's gaze suddenly locked with hers across the square. The stallion's ears pinned back, his posture instantly alert. Helen took an involuntary step backward, her hand dropping to her side. For a moment, horse and woman stared at each other, a current of something unspoken passing between them. Then Helen turned and walked quickly to her car, the red bracelet glinting in the afternoon sun. No one noticed the flash of recognition in Storm's eyes as he watched her go. No one except Emma, who understood more than anyone realized. The silence that had claimed her voice concealed a growing awareness of truths the adults around her couldn't yet see. As the sun began to set over Whisper Valley, casting long shadows across the town square, Emma turned her face to the mountains in the distance. Tomorrow would bring another dawn, another silent procession through town. But something had shifted today, a current set in motion that would eventually bring long-buried secrets to the surface. For now, though, Emma simply reached out to touch Willow's soft muzzle, finding comfort in the warmth and steady presence of the mare. In a world where words had failed her, these animals spoke a language she understood perfectly, the language of presence, of patience, of unconditional love. It was enough. For now, it had to be enough. I've completed part 1 of The Silent Voice based on your detailed outline. This first section establishes the character setting and central conflict while staying true to the original storyline you provided. Dawn came early to Eagle Rock Ranch. Emma's eyes opened at 4:30 a.m., just as they did every morning. No alarm clock needed. Her body had learned this rhythm, this silent contract with the horses. She slipped from beneath her quilt, the wooden floor cool against her bare feet. The house was quiet. Walter had returned from the hospital 3 days ago, his color better, but his movements slower than before. The doctors had insisted on rest medication and a strict diet that had the old rancher grumbling at every meal. But he was alive, and for that, Emma was grateful in ways she couldn't express. She dressed quickly, jeans, a flannel shirt that had once belonged to her mother, and worn boots that were still slightly too big. At the window, she paused, peering out at the pre-dawn landscape. The horses weren't visible yet, but she knew they were coming. They always came. Emma moved through the silent house like a ghost, avoiding the creaky floorboards she'd mentally mapped. In the kitchen, she grabbed an apple from the bowl and slipped it into her pocket. The back door opened with a whisper, and then she was outside, the October air sharp in her lungs. The world held its breath in these moments before sunrise, a stillness that matched the quiet inside Emma. She made her way to the barn, its weathered door sliding open just enough for her small frame to slip through. Inside, the familiar smells of hay leather and horses wrapped around her like a blanket. Willow's bridle hung on a peg by the door. Emma had to stretch to reach it, her fingers just brushing the worn leather. A soft whicker from outside made her turn. Through the barn window, she could see them approaching, 5 silhouettes against the gradually lightening sky. By the time Emma emerged from the barn, bridle in hand, the horses had reached the edge of the property. Storm led as always, his powerful presence commanding even in the dim light. Behind him came Thunder, Dawn, and Dusty, moving in their familiar formation. Willow broke away from the group, trotting forward to meet Emma halfway. The small gray mare lowered her head, blowing softly against Emma's cheek in greeting. Emma's fingers moved automatically, finding the spot behind Willow's ear that made the horse lean into her touch. For a moment they stood like that, child and horse, breathing in unison, sharing warmth in the cool morning air. Emma slipped the bridle over Willow's head with practiced ease. No saddle, she had never needed one with Willow. The mare stood perfectly still as Emma used a nearby stump to climb onto her back. From this vantage point, small as she was, Emma could see over the tall grass to where the other horses waited. She made a subtle gesture with her hand, a movement so slight it would have been invisible to most observers. Storm responded immediately, turning to lead the procession along their familiar route. As they moved away from the ranch house, Emma glanced back once. In an upstairs window, a curtain fell back into place, Margaret watching, as she did every morning, caught between worry and understanding. Their path took them along the edge of town where Whisper Valley was just beginning to wake. Lights flickered on in kitchens. The smell of coffee and breakfast drifted through open windows. Some residents, now accustomed to the morning ritual, waited on porches or at windows to watch the silent parade. Mrs. Garcia, an elderly woman who lived at the edge of town, stood wrapped in a shawl beside her mailbox. As Emma and the horses passed, she smiled and placed something on top of the fence post, a small knitted hat in autumn colors. Emma nodded her thanks, reaching down to take it as Willow passed. Mr. Jacobson, the town baker, left a paper bag on his gate. Inside, Emma knew would be a still warm cinnamon roll. Further along, the Peterson children waved excitedly from their front yard, their mother watching from the porch with a steaming mug in her hands. These small gestures of kindness had grown over the weeks since Walter's heart attack. It was as if the town had collectively decided to embrace Emma and her silent procession rather than fear it. Not everyone, of course. Some curtains remained firmly closed as they passed, and Helen Whitmore's house stood cold and unwelcoming at the far end of Main Street, but enough to create a sense of community around the daily ritual. "Morning, Emma." Sheriff Dobson called from his parked patrol car. He raised his coffee cup in salute. "Looking after your grandpa today." Emma nodded, her expression serious. The sheriff had been a regular visitor since Walter's heart attack, bringing groceries or simply checking in. His kindness was genuine, unlike the forced sympathy she'd endured from others. "Tell Walt I'll stop by this evening," he continued, seeming unbothered by her lack of verbal response. "Got a game of checkers to finish." Another nod, and then Emma and the horses continued on their way, leaving the town behind as they headed toward Silver Creek Trail. This was the newest addition to their route, a path that wound through the woods before emerging at the creek itself. Emma had discovered it just a week ago, and the horses seemed to enjoy the change. The trail narrowed as they entered the woods, forcing the horses to walk single file. Emma and Willow led now, with Storm taking position at the rear. Filtered sunlight dappled the path, and the only sounds were the soft thud of hooves on earth and the occasional call of a bird overhead. Here, away from the watchful eyes of the town, Emma felt something inside her begin to loosen. The constant tension that had gripped her since the accident, the knot of grief and fear and confusion, eased slightly in these quiet moments. The trail opened onto a clearing beside Silver Creek, where the water ran clear and swift over smooth stones. Emma slid from Willow's back, letting the mare drink from the creek while the other horses spread out to graze in the tall grass. Emma sat on a sun-warmed rock, hugging her knees to her chest as she watched the water flow past. In her pocket, she felt the weight of the apple she'd brought. She pulled it out, polishing it against her shirt before taking a small bite. The sweetness burst across her tongue, momentarily overwhelming her senses. A movement across the creek caught her attention. On the opposite bank, partially hidden by a stand of aspen trees, stood a woman Emma didn't recognize. She was tall and lean, with dark hair streaked with silver pulled back in a practical braid. She wore hiking boots and carried a professional-looking camera. The woman raised a hand in greeting, but made no move to cross the creek. Instead, she simply observed, her gaze moving from Emma to the horses and back again. After a moment, she raised her camera, gesturing with it and raising her eyebrows in question. Emma hesitated, then nodded permission. The sound of the camera's shutter was barely audible over the babbling of the creek. The woman took several photos, then lowered the camera and smiled. "Thank you," she called across the water. "I'm Evelyn Shaw. I'm studying horse behavior." Emma didn't respond, but she didn't look away either. Something about the woman's direct manner was refreshing, no pity, no awkward attempt to coax words from her. "That's quite a bond you have with them," Evelyn continued, seemingly comfortable with the one-sided conversation. "Especially the dappled gray mare. Andalusian mix." Emma nodded, surprised by the accurate assessment. "Thought so. Beautiful confirmation." Evelyn glanced at her watch. "I won't keep you. Maybe I'll see you here again sometime." With a final wave, the woman turned and disappeared back into the trees on the far side of the creek. Emma watched her go, curiosity temporarily overriding her habitual caution. There had been something different about Evelyn Shaw, a straightforwardness that reminded Emma of her mother. The memory came unbidden, her mother standing in the barn explaining the proper way to brush Storm's coat. "Always in the direction of the hair growth," she'd said. "Horses appreciate directness. No secrets, no hiding. Just clear intention." Sarah Harper had lived by those words, facing life with the same honesty she expected from her horses. A soft nicker pulled Emma from her thoughts. Willow had finished drinking and now stood nearby, head lowered to Emma's level. The mare's dark eyes seemed to hold a question. Time to go. Emma rose, brushing off her jeans before climbing back onto Willow's back. With a subtle movement of her heels, she guided the mare back toward the trail. The other horses fell into formation behind them, Storm taking his position at the lead once they reached the main path. By the time they returned to Eagle Rock Ranch, the sun was fully up, bathing the valley in golden light. Margaret stood on the porch, her face relaxing into relief when she spotted them approaching. "There you are," she called as Emma slid from Willow's back. "Just in time for breakfast. Your grandfather's asking for you." Emma unbridled Willow, giving the mare a final pat before the horse rejoined the herd. Storm regarded Emma for a long moment, his intelligent eyes seeming to convey something important before he turned and led the others toward the south pasture. Inside, Walter sat at the kitchen table, his face lined with fatigue, but his eyes bright. "There's my girl," he said, his voice slightly weaker than it had been before the heart attack. "Good ride this morning." Emma nodded, taking her place at the table. Margaret set a plate of scrambled eggs in front of her, the yellow flecked with bits of green herb. "Sheriff called," Walter said, watching as Emma picked up her fork. "Says some reporter's been asking questions about you and the horses. Woman named Shaw or something." Emma's head snapped up, her eyes wide. Margaret noticed the reaction. "Do you know who that is, Emma?" Emma hesitated, then reached for the notepad they kept on the table. Since the heart attack, she'd begun communicating more through writing, though she still used it sparingly. In careful letters, she wrote, "Saw her at Creek. Taking pictures." Walter frowned. She say what she wanted. Emma wrote again, "Studying horses." Margaret and Walter exchanged a glance. "Well," Margaret said carefully, "I suppose that's not so bad. But maybe stay on our property for a few days just till we find out more about her." Emma's face fell, her disappointment evident. The morning rides had become essential to her, the only time she felt truly connected to something beyond her grief. Walter placed a gnarled hand over hers. "Just for a little while, Emma. We need to be careful with all this attention on you and the horses. Helen's still looking for any excuse to cause trouble." Emma nodded reluctantly, understanding the concern even as she chafed against it. The walls of the house suddenly seemed closer, the future more confined than it had been just moments before. Dr. Evelyn Shaw checked into the Whisper Valley Inn late that afternoon. The small hotel run by Barney Thompson was the only accommodation in town, its 6 rooms, usually occupied by the occasional tourist or visiting relative. "What brings you to our neck of the woods, Dr. Shaw?" Barney asked as he handed her the room key. At 60, he had the weathered face of someone who spent most of his life outdoors and the curious eyes of a natural gossip. "Research," Evelyn replied, signing the registration form. "I'm studying equine-assisted therapy, particularly in cases involving children with trauma." Barney's eyebrows rose. "You hear about the Harper girl, then?" Evelyn smiled noncommittally. "I'm interested in several cases throughout the region. Whisper Valley happens to be one stop on my research trip. Well, you've come to the right place if it's the Harper situation you're looking into. Town's been talking about nothing else since Walter's heart attack. Some folks say that horse storm, they call him, knew it was coming before anyone else did, even before Emma figured it out." "Fascinating," Evelyn murmured, her professional interest clearly piqued. "I'd love to hear more about that, Mr. Thompson." "Call me Barney, everyone does." He leaned on the counter, settling in for what was clearly a favorite story. "I was there that day at the town meeting." Emma started tugging on Dr. Reyes's sleeve, pointing at her grandpa. Nobody else had noticed anything wrong yet. Then that big black stallion started raising hell outside, pawing and whinnying. Next thing we know, Walt's having a heart attack. The timing could be coincidental, Evelyn suggested, though her tone indicated she wasn't dismissing the story. Barney shook his head firmly. "Not a chance, that horse knew. Same way he seems to know when Emma needs something before she does. It's uncanny." "And the town, how do people feel about the situation?" "Mixed," Barney admitted. "Most folks are supportive. The girl's been through enough losing her parents like that. And the morning rides, they've become something special. People leave little gifts along the route just to see Emma smile." "But," Evelyn prompted, sensing there was more. "But Helen Whitmore's got a bee in her bonnet about those horses. Says they're dangerous, wants them gone. She's got a few people convinced, mostly newcomers, who don't know the Harpers from way back." Evelyn nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like to speak with Helen if possible. And Dr. Reyes, of course." "Elena Dr. Reyes, she's usually at her clinic until 5. As for Helen," Barney grimaced slightly, "she lives in the big white house at the end of Maple Street. Can't miss it. Just don't mention my name when you go. We're not exactly on speaking terms." Evelyn raised an eyebrow questioningly. "Long story involving a zoning dispute and her prize rose bushes," Barney said with a dismissive wave. "Ancient history now." Evelyn took her key. "Thank you for the information, Barney. I appreciate the local insight." "One more thing," Barney added as she turned to go. "If you're planning to observe Emma and those horses, best place is along Silver Creek Trail. She rides there most mornings around sunrise. Evelyn smiled. I'll keep that in mind. In her room, Evelyn unpacked her laptop and camera equipment. The photos she'd taken that morning were transferred to her computer, filling the screen with images of Emma and the horses at the creek. She studied them with a professional eye, noting the positioning of the horses relative to Emma, the attentive posture of Storm, the relaxed intimacy between the child and Willow. Her phone rang, interrupting her analysis. The caller ID showed Dr. Chen, Missoula Children's Center. Lisa, Evelyn answered. Thanks for returning my call. Of course, Dr. Lisa Chen replied. I've been following your research with interest. How's the field study going? Fascinating, actually. I've just arrived in Whisper Valley to observe the Harper case you mentioned in your email. Ah, Emma, Dr. Chen's voice softened. A challenging case. Classic trauma-induced mutism complicated by pre-existing signs of mild ASD. She's been resistant to traditional therapy approaches. But responding to the horses? Remarkably so. Her grandparents report increased engagement, better sleep patterns, and even some written communication since the daily rides began. The horses seem to provide a structured routine that makes her feel secure. Evelyn clicked through her photos as they spoke. Based on what I observed this morning, the herd dynamics are extraordinary. The horses have essentially formed a protective circle around her with clearly defined roles. It's almost like watching a therapy program that developed organically. That's why I thought you should see it, Dr. Chen agreed. It's the kind of natural connection we try to replicate in structured equine therapy programs, but rarely achieve to this degree. The black stallion Storm seems particularly attuned to her, almost preternaturally so according to local accounts. Dr. Chen chuckled. I've learned to keep an open mind about such things. Animals often perceive what we miss, but be careful about attaching too much significance to anecdotal reports. People in grief sometimes see patterns where none exist. Noted, Evelyn said. What about the town dynamics? My innkeeper mentioned someone named Helen Whitmore, who seems opposed to the situation. A pause. Helen is complicated. She was the school principal for many years, very traditional in her approach to education and child-rearing. I think she genuinely believes she's acting in Emma's best interest, but there's something else there too, something personal. Any idea what? Nothing concrete, but I've noticed she seems particularly focused on Storm more than the other horses, almost as if she has a specific grievance against him. Evelyn made a note. Interesting. I'll look into that. Just remember, Dr. Chen cautioned, your primary focus should be the therapeutic relationship between Emma and the horses. That's what makes this case valuable to your research. Of course, but understanding the social context is important too. Therapeutic interventions don't exist in a vacuum. After ending the call, Evelyn returned to her analysis of the photos. In one image, Storm stood slightly apart from the other, horses, his head raised, ears pricked forward, alert to something beyond the frame. She zoomed in, studying his posture. Evelyn had worked with horses for over 20 years, specializing in equine-assisted therapy for the past decade. She'd seen remarkable connections between horses and humans, particularly children with trauma or developmental challenges. But there was something different about what she'd witnessed that morning, something that went beyond her professional experience. She closed her laptop and checked her watch. Still time to visit Dr. Reyes before the clinic closed. Perhaps the veterinarian could provide more insight into Storm's unusual behavior. Elena Reyes was just finishing her paperwork when the bell above the clinic door jingled. She looked up to see a tall woman with a silver-streaked braid entering the small waiting room. Can I help you? Elena asked, setting aside the patient files she'd been updating. Dr. Reyes, I'm Evelyn Shaw. The woman extended her hand. I'm a researcher specializing in equine-assisted therapy. I was hoping to speak with you about Emma Harper and her horses. Elena shook the offered hand, her expression cautious. Dr. Shaw, Sheriff Dobson mentioned you were asking questions around town. May I ask why you're interested in Emma's situation? Professional curiosity primarily. I'm conducting a study on naturally occurring therapeutic relationships between children and horses. Dr. Chen in Missoula suggested this case might be relevant to my research. Elena relaxed slightly at the mention of Dr. Chen. Lisa's been helpful with Emma's care. If she referred you, that's good enough for me. What would you like to know? I observed Emma with the horses this morning at Silver Creek. The herd dynamics were fascinating. I'm particularly interested in Storm the Black Stallion. He seems unusually attuned to Emma. Elena nodded, her expression warming as she discussed her favorite subject. Storm is exceptional. Sarah, Emma's mother, raised him from a colt. She always said he was more perceptive than most humans she knew. I understand he somehow anticipated Walter Harper's heart attack. Yes, it was remarkable. Elena described the scene at the town hall in detail. Before any of us realized what was happening, Storm was already reacting. And Emma, she seemed to understand what Storm was trying to communicate. Could it have been coincidence? Evelyn asked, her tone suggesting she was playing devil's advocate rather than expressing skepticism. Elena considered this. Possible, but unlikely. I've seen similar incidents on a smaller scale. Storm reacting to Emma's needs before she expresses them, alerting to potential dangers before they're apparent to the rest of us. Almost like a service animal. Exactly like that, though, without the formal training. And it's not just Storm, the entire herd seems to have organized itself around Emma's protection and support. Willow provides comfort, Thunder watches for threats. Dawn stays close when Emma seems anxious, and Dusty makes her laugh. Evelyn smiled. Therapeutic roles that develop naturally. Fascinating. The problem, Elena continued, her expression darkening, is that not everyone sees it that way. Helen Whitmore has been campaigning to have the horses removed, claiming they're dangerous. I've heard about Helen. Any idea why she's so opposed to the situation? Elena shrugged. Officially, she claims it's about safety, but there's something else going on. She seems to have a particular issue with Storm, and any history between them. Not that I know of. Helen's not really a horse person. Never has been as far as I'm aware. Evelyn made a note in her small notebook. I'd like to interview Helen, get her perspective. Do you think she'd be willing to speak with me? Probably. Helen rarely passes up an opportunity to voice her opinions. Elena glanced at her watch. I'm finishing up here. If you'd like, I can take you out to Eagle Rock Ranch tomorrow morning. Introduce you to Walter and Margaret properly. I'd appreciate that. Around what time? 7. Emma will be back from her morning ride by then. Evelyn nodded. 7 works. Thank you for your time, Dr. Reyes. Elena, please. And Dr. Shaw. These horses are the best thing that's happened to Emma since the accident. Whatever your research concludes, I hope it helps people understand that. That's my goal, Evelyn assured her. And it's Evelyn. I have a feeling we'll be seeing a lot of each other during my stay. Helen Whitmore's house was exactly as Barney had described it. A large white colonial at the end of Maple Street, its garden meticulously maintained despite the advancing autumn. As Evelyn approached the front door, she noticed the curtains in a side window twitch slightly. The door opened before she could knock. Helen stood in the entryway, her steel gray hair perfectly styled, her posture rigid. Dr. Shaw, I presume Sheriff Dobson mentioned you might stop by. Word travels fast in small towns, Evelyn observed with a smile. Thank you for seeing me without an appointment, Miss Whitmore. Mrs. Helen corrected automatically, though I've been widowed for 5 years now. Please come in. The interior of the house was as immaculate as its exterior antique furniture, polished to a shine, hardwood floors, gleaming not a pillow out of place. Helen led Evelyn to a formal sitting room, gesturing to a brocade armchair. Tea. Helen offered, already moving toward a silver service arranged on a side table. Thank you, that would be lovely. Helen poured with practiced precision, her movements efficient and controlled. Sheriff Dobson says you're researching the Harper situation. May I ask in what capacity? I'm studying equine-assisted therapy, particularly in cases involving childhood trauma. Emma's relationship with the horses presents an interesting, naturally occurring example. Helen's lips thinned slightly as she handed Evelyn a delicate teacup. I see. And are you approaching this from a medical perspective or both medical and behavioral? I have doctorates in veterinary medicine, in child psychology with a specialization in animal-assisted therapeutic interventions. Helen's eyebrows rose marginally, the first crack in her composed facade. Impressive credentials. Then you must understand my concerns about safety. A child in Emma's condition shouldn't be exposed to unpredictable animals. What specific behaviors have you observed that concern you? Evelyn asked, sipping her tea. Helen hesitated, then crossed to a small desk in the corner. She returned with a folder similar to the one she'd presented at the town meeting. These photos were taken over the past few weeks. As you can see, the stallion Storm displays aggressive posturing on multiple occasions. Evelyn examined the photographs carefully. They showed Storm with his head lowered, ears back, in what could be interpreted as threatening posture to an untrained eye. These actually show defensive, not aggressive positioning, she explained. He's responding to a perceived threat to Emma, not initiating aggression. The distinction seems academic when a 1,000-pound animal is charging at a pedestrian, Helen countered. Was anyone actually charged or injured? Not yet, Helen admitted, but it's only a matter of time. Those animals are too powerful and too wild to be roaming freely, especially around a child who cannot call for help. Evelyn studied Helen over the rim of her teacup. Your concern for Emma seems very personal, Mrs. Whitmore. Did you know her parents well? Something flickered across Helen's face, too quick to identify. I was principal when Sarah attended school here. Later, when she married Michael, I knew them socially. This is a small town, Dr. Shaw. Everyone knows everyone. And Storm, did you have any particular interaction with him before Sarah and Michael's deaths? Helen's hand moved unconsciously to her wrist, where a red leather bracelet stood out starkly against her pale skin. No. Why do you ask? Just trying to understand the dynamics at play. Evelyn gestured toward the bracelet. That's an interesting piece. Handmade. Helen's fingers closed around the bracelet protectively. Yes, a gift from years ago. Grocker, before Evelyn could inquire further, Helen stood abruptly. I'm afraid I have a committee meeting this evening, Dr. Shaw. Is there anything else you needed for your research? Recognizing the dismissal, Evelyn rose as well. Not at the moment. Thank you for your time and insights, Mrs. Whitmore. I may have follow-up questions as my research progresses. Of course. Helen's smile didn't reach her eyes. Though I hope your research will consider the welfare of the child above romantic notions about horse whisperers and animal intuition. At the door, Evelyn paused. One last question, if you don't mind. Were you driving on Route 16 the night of the Harper accident? The color drained from Helen's face. What? No, I was home all evening. Why would you ask that? Evelyn shrugged casually. Just establishing a timeline for my research. The accident is the precipitating event for Emma's current situation after all. I had nothing to do with that terrible night. Helen said, her voice tight. And I resent the implication. No implication intended, Mrs. Whitmore. Just thorough research. Thank you again for your time. As Evelyn walked back to the inn, she reflected on Helen's reaction. The woman's concern about the horses seemed genuine, but there was something else there, something that had made her physically recoil at the mention of the accident. And that bracelet, the way she touched it when Storm was mentioned, seemed significant somehow. Back in her room, Evelyn made detailed notes about both conversations. Elena's warmth and openness contrasted sharply with Helen's controlled defensiveness. Both women clearly believed they were acting in Emma's best interest, yet their perspectives couldn't have been more different. Tomorrow's visit to Eagle Rock Ranch would hopefully provide more pieces to the puzzle. For now, Evelyn turned her attention back to the photos from that morning, studying the silent communication between a traumatized child and the horses that had somehow become her voice. The following days fell into a pattern. Each morning, Evelyn would position herself along Emma's riding route, observing and photographing the interactions between the child and the horses. Emma, initially wary, gradually accepted Evelyn's presence, occasionally allowing her to walk alongside during parts of the ride. Walter and Margaret, after meeting Evelyn and understanding her research, gave permission for these observations. Walter's health was improving slowly, but he remained housebound most days, his former strength diminished by the heart attack. It's good to have another set of eyes on her, Margaret confided to Evelyn over coffee one morning. We worry, you know, her being out there alone. She's not alone, Evelyn replied gently. Those horses watch over her more carefully than most human guardians would. Margaret smiled sadly. I know, it's just hard. Losing Sarah and Michael, then Emma stopping talking. Sometimes I wonder if we're doing enough for her. Antoine, from what I've observed, you're providing exactly what she needs most right now. Stability, patience, and the freedom to heal in her own way. On the fifth day of Evelyn's research, the pattern changed. Emma's morning ride took her past Helen Whitmore's house, a route she normally avoided. Evelyn, following at a respectful distance, noticed Emma's posture stiffen as they approached the white colonial. Helen was in her front garden pruning late-blooming roses. She straightened as the procession approached, secateurs still in hand. "Good morning, Emma," she called, her voice overly bright. Emma didn't respond or look in Helen's direction. Storm, however, reacted immediately. The stallion's head came up, ears pinned back, nostrils flaring. He moved to position himself between Emma and Helen, his body language unmistakably protective. Helen took a step back, her face paling slightly. The secateurs in her hand caught the morning light flashing silver. Storm pawed the ground once, a warning. "Control that animal," Helen said sharply, "or I'll call the sheriff." Emma made a subtle gesture with her hand. Storm ceased pawing but remained alert, his eyes fixed on Helen. Specifically, Evelyn noticed on the red bracelet visible at Helen's wrist. The moment passed. Emma guided Willow forward, the other horses following, giving Helen's property a wide berth. Evelyn lingered, watching Helen's reaction. The older woman stood frozen until the horses were out of sight. Then her shoulders slumped slightly, and she pressed a hand to her forehead. For an instant, she looked much older than her 65 years, fragile and haunted. Then she noticed Evelyn watching. Her face hardened instantly. "Documenting more of that stallion's aggressive behavior, Dr. Shaw." "Actually, I was noting his protective response to what he perceived as a potential threat," Evelyn replied calmly. "Horses have excellent memory, especially for people or situations associated with danger." Helen's hand moved unconsciously to the red bracelet. "Are you implying I'm dangerous to that child?" "I'm not implying anything, Mrs. Whitmore. Merely observing animal behavior, which is my area of expertise." Helen's eyes narrowed. "You've been here nearly a week now, Dr. Shaw. How much longer will your research continue?" "That depends on what I discover." Evelyn gestured toward the bracelet. "That's an unusual piece of jewelry. May I ask where you got it?" Helen's fingers closed around the bracelet. "It was my husband's. Daniel made it years ago. Daniel was into leather work. Among other things, he was good with his hands." Helen's expression softened momentarily with the memory, then hardened again. "If you'll excuse me, I have roses to tend." As Evelyn walked away, she mentally added another piece to the puzzle. The bracelet had belonged to Helen's late husband, which might explain her protective attitude toward it. But it didn't explain Storm's reaction to it or why Helen specifically touched it when discussing the stallion. Evelyn caught up with Emma at Silver Creek, where the girl had stopped to allow the horses to drink. Emma sat on her usual rock, watching the water flow. She looked up as Evelyn approached, her expression unreadable. "May I join you?" Evelyn asked. Emma nodded, scooting over slightly to make room on the large rock. Evelyn sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "I noticed Storm seemed upset by Helen Whitmore," Evelyn said conversationally, as if Emma's silence was simply a preference rather than a condition. "Has he always reacted that way to her?" Emma hesitated, then reached for a stick lying nearby. In the soft mud at the creek's edge, she drew a simple picture, a bracelet. "The red bracelet she wears?" Evelyn asked. Emma nodded, then added more to her drawing, a crude representation of Storm, his head lowered toward the bracelet. "Storm recognizes the bracelet," Evelyn interpreted. Another nod, more emphatic this time. "Do you know why?" Emma's face clouded. She shook her head, then erased her drawing with a swipe of her hand. The conversation, such as it was, had ended. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the horses graze nearby. Eventually, Emma slid from the rock and walked to Willow, signaling it was time to return home. As they rode back toward Eagle Rock Ranch, Evelyn reflected on what she'd learned. Storm's reaction to Helen, or more specifically to the bracelet she wore, seemed significant. It created a connection between Helen and the Harper family that went beyond her stated concerns about safety. But what was that connection, and how did it relate to the accident that had claimed Sarah and Michael's lives? The breakthrough came unexpectedly during Evelyn's second week in Whisper Valley. She was reviewing her research notes in her room at the inn when Barney knocked on her door. "Got something you might want to see," he said when she opened it. "Been going through some old security footage from the night of the Harper accident." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. You have security cameras here at the inn. Barney nodded. Installed them 3 years ago after some vandalism. They cover the parking lot and the road out front. Route 16 runs right past the inn. The same Route 16 where the accident occurred. Exactly, it happened about a mile east of here. But all traffic heading that way passes by my cameras. Barney held up a thumb drive. Found something interesting from that night. Evelyn invited him in. Barney inserted the drive into her laptop and navigated to a video file. This is time-stamped 9:42 p.m. on April 15th. The accident happened around 9:55 according to the police report. Elon, the footage was grainy, but clear enough to make out vehicles passing on the road. Rain streaked across the camera lens, reducing visibility further. There, Barney said, pointing as a silver sedan appeared on screen. That's Helen's car. Mercedes only one like it in town. Evelyn leaned closer. The car moved slowly, seeming to weave slightly on the wet road. Are you suggesting Helen was involved in the accident? Not suggesting anything, Barney said carefully. Just noting she was on that road that night, heading east, same direction as where the accident happened. And when I mentioned this footage to Sheriff Dobson, he got real quiet, then said the case was closed and I should mind my own business. Did the official investigation identify the other driver? Barney shook his head. Hit and run. The other car sideswiped the Harpers, forced them off the road into a tree. Driver never stopped. Evelyn studied the footage again. Helen told me she was home all evening that night. Well, this says otherwise. Barney tapped the screen. And look here at the edge of the frame. See that flash of red on her wrist as she passes under the streetlight? That's that bracelet she always wears. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. Barney, do you mind if I keep this drive for a while? I'd like to study this footage more carefully. Be my guest. Got it backed up anyway. Barney stood to leave. Just be careful who you share it with. Helen's got a lot of influence in this town. After Barney left, Evelyn watched the footage several more times. The car was definitely Helen's, and the timestamp placed her on Route 16 shortly before the accident. It wasn't proof of involvement, but it contradicted Helen's statement about being home all evening. More importantly, it created a possible explanation for Storm's reaction to the red bracelet. If Helen had been wearing it the night of the accident, and if she had indeed been the hit-and-run driver, Storm might have seen it from the Harper car. Horses had exceptional night vision and memory for details associated with danger. But why would Helen, a respected community member with no apparent grudge against the Harpers, cause such an accident? And why the subsequent campaign against the horses, particularly Storm Evelyn, needed more information. Tomorrow was Sunday, no morning ride for Emma as the Harpers attended church. It would be an opportunity to speak with Sheriff Dobson without the risk of being overheard. Sheriff Jim Dobson was washing his patrol car when Evelyn approached the small sheriff's office the next morning. He looked up, squinting against the autumn sun. Dr. Shaw, he greeted her, setting down his sponge. What can I do for you on this fine Sunday? I'd like to discuss the Harper accident, Evelyn said directly. Specifically, the hit-and-run investigation. The sheriff's friendly expression faded. That case is closed. No suspects identified. But there was a suspect, wasn't there? Someone whose car was on Route 16 that night, heading in the same direction as the accident. Dobson's eyes narrowed. You've been talking to Barney. He showed me the security footage from the inn. Helen Whitmore's car is clearly visible, despite what she told me about being home all evening. The sheriff sighed heavily, gesturing for Evelyn to follow him inside the office. Once the door closed behind them, he dropped into his desk chair, suddenly looking older and more tired. Look, Dr. Shaw, this town has enough problems without digging up old investigations. The case is closed. Because there wasn't enough evidence, or because of who the suspect was. Dobson gave her a hard look. You're here to study horse therapy, not play detective. What's your real interest in this? I believe there's a connection between the accident and Helen's campaign against the horses, particularly Storm. If Helen was responsible for the accident, it would explain her determination to have Storm removed. Because Storm saw her that night. He recognizes the red bracelet she wears, the one that belonged to her late husband. Every time Storm sees that bracelet, he reacts defensively, protecting Emma. The sheriff was silent for a long moment. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a thin file. What I'm about to tell you stays in this room, understood, for Emma's sake, if nothing else. Evelyn nodded. We investigated the accident thoroughly. Sarah and Michael Harper were well loved in this community. The impact forced their car off the road into a tree. Michael died instantly. Sarah survived the initial crash but died en route to the hospital. And Emma, minor physical injuries. The psychological trauma, though, he shook his head. She hasn't spoken a word since. What about the other driver? Dobson opened the file. We found paint transfers on the Harper vehicle consistent with a silver Mercedes. Helen owns the only car matching that description in Whisper Valley. Barney's footage places her on that road at the right time, but it's not proof she caused the accident. Did you question her? Of course. She claimed she was home all evening. When confronted with the footage, she admitted driving to Missoula for a late meeting, but insisted she returned home before the accident occurred. You didn't believe her. Dobson closed the file. Belief isn't evidence, Dr. Shaw. And Helen Whitmore has been a pillar of this community for 40 years. Her late husband was my predecessor as sheriff. Without an eyewitness or a confession, I couldn't make a case. What about the bracelet, the red leather one she always wears? What about it? Storm reacts to it specifically. I've observed this multiple times now. It suggests a connection between the bracelet and the accident. Dobson frowned. You're suggesting a horse could identify a hit-and-run driver? Based on a bracelet, no judge would ever accept that. I'm not talking about legal evidence. I'm trying to understand the dynamics at play here. If Helen was responsible for the accident, even unintentionally, it would explain her fixation on removing Storm. He's a living reminder of her guilt. The sheriff studied her for a long moment. You think she's afraid the horse will somehow expose her? I think she's afraid of what Storm represents, truth that can't be buried or explained away. And I think that fear has developed into an obsession that's now threatening Emma's well-being. Dobson rubbed his face wearily. Even if you're right, what good does stirring this up do now Sarah and Michael are gone? Emma's been through enough without a public scandal. I'm not looking to create a scandal. I'm trying to protect Emma and the horses that are helping her heal. Evelyn leaned forward. Sheriff Helen's campaign is gaining momentum. The town council meets again next week to review the 6-month arrangement. If she convinces them the horses are dangerous, they'll order them removed, Dobson finished grimly. And Emma loses the only therapy that's helped her. Exactly. The sheriff was silent for a long moment, considering. I can't officially reopen the case without new evidence, but I can keep a closer eye on Helen and on Emma and the horses. That's all I'm asking, Evelyn assured him. For now, Hanamona Sunna. As she left the sheriff's office, Evelyn's mind was racing with possibilities. The pieces were starting to fit together, Helen's presence on Route 16 that night. Storm's reaction to the bracelet, Helen's determination to remove the horses from Emma's life. But without concrete evidence or a confession, it remained speculation. What she needed was a way to confirm the connection between the bracelet and the accident. And for that, she needed to understand more about the night Sarah and Michael Harper died. The opportunity came 3 days later. Emma's morning ride took her along a new path that wound past the local cemetery. Evelyn, following at her usual distance, watched as the girl guided Willow through the wrought iron gates, the other horses waiting respectfully outside. Emma dismounted near a double headstone set beneath a spreading oak tree. From her position at the cemetery entrance, Evelyn could see the names carved in granite, Sarah Elizabeth Harper and Michael James Harper, along with their shared dates, together in life and in death. The child knelt beside the grave, her small hand tracing the carved letters. After a moment, she reached into her pocket and withdrew something small and bright, a red leather bracelet identical to the one Helen wore. Evelyn's breath caught. Emma placed the bracelet gently on the grave, then sat cross-legged on the grass, her expression solemn but peaceful. It was the most deliberate act Evelyn had witnessed from the child since beginning her observations. After nearly half an hour, Emma rose, retrieved the bracelet, and returned to Willow. As she guided the mare back toward the cemetery gates, she spotted Evelyn watching. Instead of the wariness Evelyn expected, Emma's expression held something else, a decision reached. The child walked Willow directly to where Evelyn stood. From her pocket, Emma produced a folded piece of paper. She handed it to Evelyn without ceremony, then mounted Willow and rejoined the waiting horses. Evelyn unfolded the paper once Emma had ridden away. In careful childish handwriting were three simple sentences. Dad made two red bracelets. One for Mom, one for Helen. Storm knows. The implications were staggering. Michael Harper had made two identical bracelets, one for his wife, one for Helen Whitmore. It suggested a connection between them that went beyond casual acquaintance. And somehow Storm recognized that connection. Evelyn needed to speak with Walter and Margaret immediately. She drove directly to Eagle Rock Ranch, arriving just as Emma and the horses were returning from their ride. Margaret met her on the porch, concern evident in her expression. "Evelyn, we weren't expecting you this morning. I need to ask you something important," Evelyn said, keeping her voice low as Emma led Willow to the barn. "About Michael and Helen Whitmore." Margaret's face closed immediately. "What about them? Emma showed me a red leather bracelet today. She left a note saying Michael made two of them, one for Sarah, one for Helen." The older woman sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping. "You'd better come inside. Walter should hear this too." In the kitchen, Walter sat at the table, a cup of coffee cooling before him. He looked up as they entered, his expression questioning. "She knows about the bracelets," Margaret said simply. Walter nodded slowly. "Sit down, Dr. Shaw. This isn't a short story." Evelyn took a seat, waiting, as Margaret poured coffee for both of them. The kitchen was quiet, the only sound the ticking of an old clock on the wall. "Michael and Helen's son Daniel were best friends growing up," Walter began. "Inseparable from grade school through high school. Daniel was a talented kid, good with his hands, always making things. Leatherwork was his specialty." Margaret picked up the thread. "When they were 17, Daniel and Michael were in a car accident. Daniel was driving. He didn't survive. Helen never forgave Michael for living when her son died," Walter continued. "Even though it wasn't his fault, the other driver ran a red light, hit them broadside on Daniel's side. Before the accident, Daniel had made matching red leather bracelets for both boys," Margaret explained. "Michael never took his off afterward, said it helped him remember his friend. Years later, he learned how to make them himself. He made one for Sarah when they got engaged." "And one for Helen," Evelyn added. "Why?" Walter sighed heavily. "Attempt at reconciliation. After Sarah and Michael married, he tried to make peace with Helen. Gave her a bracelet identical to Daniel's, said he wanted to honor her son's memory. Did it work? For a while, Helen seemed to soften. She even attended Emma's christening. But then something happened. We never knew exactly what. Helen accused Michael of betraying Daniel's memory somehow. The old bitterness returned worse than before." Evelyn considered this new information. "And the night of the accident, you think Helen was responsible?" Walter and Margaret exchanged a glance. "We've wondered," Margaret admitted. "The timing of her car on Route 16, her campaign against Storm afterward. It fits. But we can't prove anything," Walter added. "And stirring up accusations won't bring Sarah and Michael back." "What about Emma?" Evelyn asked. "Does she know or suspect?" "Emma sees more than most adults give her credit for," Margaret said softly. "She hasn't said anything well, she doesn't say anything at all, but she watches, she remembers, and she trusts Storm's judgment." Evelyn nodded slowly. "Storm recognizes the bracelet from the night of the accident. That's why he reacts defensively whenever Helen wears it near Emma. Horses don't forget," Walter confirmed, "especially not something traumatic like that night." "The town council meets tomorrow to review the 6-month arrangement," Evelyn said. "Helen will undoubtedly push for the horses to be removed." Walter's expression hardened. "We won't let that happen. Those horses are all Emma has left." "I'd like to help," Evelyn offered. "My research supports the therapeutic benefit Emma receives from the horses. I can testify to that effect." "We'd appreciate that," Margaret said, reaching across the table to squeeze Evelyn's hand. "But be careful. Helen has a lot of influence in this town, and she doesn't forgive easily." As Evelyn drove back to the inn, her mind was working through the implications of what she'd learned. The connection between the Harper and Whitmore families was deeper and more tragic than she'd imagined. A friendship destroyed by one accident, potentially followed by an act of revenge years later. And caught in the middle was Emma, a child who had lost everything except the horses that had become her voice. The town hall was even more crowded for the review meeting than it had been for the initial hearing. Word had spread about Dr. Shaw's research, and many townspeople were curious to hear her findings. Emma sat between Walter and Margaret in the front row, her expression solemn. Dr. Reyes sat directly behind them. Helen Whitmore arrived last, dressed immaculately, as always the red bracelet visible at her wrist. She took her seat on the opposite side of the aisle pointedly, avoiding looking at the Harper family. Mayor Jenkins called the meeting to order. Today we're reviewing the arrangement regarding the Harper horses. As you'll recall, 6 months ago, we granted a grace period for Walter and Margaret Harper to either construct proper fencing or make alternative arrangements. Sheriff Dobson will begin with his report on any incidents during this period. Sheriff Dobson stood. There have been no incidents involving the Harper horses during the past 3 months. Storm has worn the tracking device as required, and the data shows the horses have remained within the agreed-upon boundaries. No complaints have been filed by any property owners regarding trespassing or damage. Thank you, Sheriff, the mayor acknowledged. Dr. Reyes, do you have anything to add from a veterinary perspective? Elena rose. The horses are in excellent health and exhibit no concerning behaviors. Their routine has remained consistent morning rides, with Emma followed by grazing in the permitted areas. Storm in particular has shown remarkable restraint and intelligence in managing the herd's movements. Mayor Jenkins nodded. We also have Dr. Evelyn Shaw with us today, a researcher specializing in equine-assisted therapy. Dr. Shaw has been observing Emma and the horses for the past 2 weeks. Dr. Shaw, Evelyn approached the podium, her research notes organized before her. Thank you, Mayor Jenkins. As many of you know, I've been conducting a study on naturally occurring therapeutic relationships between children and horses. Emma Harper's case is exceptional in this regard. She proceeded to detail her observations, explaining the specific roles each horse had adopted in relation to Emma's needs. What we're seeing here is an organic therapeutic system that would be nearly impossible to replicate in a clinical setting. The horses, particularly Storm and Willow, have become Emma's primary means of engaging with the world. They provide structure, comfort, and a sense of control that is essential for her healing process. Evelyn turned slightly to address the entire room. Based on my professional assessment, separating Emma from these horses would be detrimental to her psychological well-being. It would effectively remove the therapeutic support system that has been her lifeline since the accident. A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Several people nodded approvingly. Helen, however, leaned forward to whisper something to her neighbor, her expression dismissive. Thank you, Dr. Shaw, the mayor said when she finished. Now I understand Mrs. Whitmore has additional concerns she wishes to present. Helen stood smoothing her skirt before approaching the podium. Thank you, Mayor. While I appreciate Dr. Shaw's professional opinion, I believe she's overlooking a fundamental issue: safety. These horses, particularly the stallion, continue to display aggressive behavior when they perceive a threat to Emma. She produced new photographs similar to those she'd shown at the previous meeting. These were taken just last week. As you can see, Storm is clearly in an aggressive posture, responding to a passerby who simply greeted Emma. Evelyn stood. Mayor, if I may respond, those photos show defensive, not aggressive positioning. Storm is protecting Emma, not threatening random citizens. Pudieno. The distinction seems academic when a child's safety is at stake, Helen countered. The fact remains that these horses are not properly contained, and Emma Harper, due to her condition, cannot call for help if something goes wrong. Nothing has gone wrong in 3 months, Walter interjected. Those horses have been Emma's companions since the day she was born. They'd never hurt her. Intentions aside, Helen continued smoothly, I believe the original issue remains unaddressed. The Harpers do not have adequate property to legally maintain 5 horses. Town ordinance requires 1 acre per horse, and they currently have only 5 acres total, most of which is occupied by the house and barn. A technical point, but an effective one. Murmurs of concern rippled through the audience. Mayor Jenkins frowned. Mr. Harper, have you made any progress toward constructing proper fencing as agreed upon? Walter shook his head reluctantly. We've been setting aside what we can, but with medical bills and Emma's care, it hasn't been enough. The mayor looked troubled. I understand your circumstances, but the ordinance exists for good reason. If I may, Dr. Reyes interjected, several neighboring property owners have provided written permission for the horses to graze their land. Functionally, the horses have access to more than 20 acres. But without proper fencing, there's no guarantee they'll remain within those boundaries, Helen pointed out, and permission can be withdrawn at any time. The debate continued, becoming increasingly technical and heated. Emma sat very still throughout, her eyes fixed on her hands folded in her lap. Occasionally, she would glance toward the window where Storm could be seen waiting at the edge of the town square, as if listening to the proceedings. Finally, Mayor Jenkins held up a hand for silence. I think we've heard all sides of this issue. Before we make a final decision, does anyone else wish to speak? To everyone's surprise, Barney Thompson stood. I do, Mayor. I have some information that may be relevant to these proceedings. Helen's head snapped up, her expression suddenly wary. Go ahead, Mr. Thompson, the mayor allowed. Barney approached the podium, a thumb drive in his hand. I believe this council should be aware of certain facts regarding the night Sarah and Michael Harper died. My security cameras captured footage that places Helen Whitmore's car on Route 16 shortly before the accident, despite her claims to have been home all evening. A shocked murmur ran through the room. Helen half rose from her seat, her face pale. This is completely irrelevant to the matter at hand. I disagree, Barney continued calmly. It speaks directly to Mrs. Whitmore's motives in seeking to remove Storm from Emma's life. What motives? Someone called from the back of the room. Evelyn stood. Storm was in the Harper vehicle the night of the accident. He witnessed what happened, and he recognizes something specific about Mrs. Whitmore. The red bracelet she wears, identical to one Sarah Harper owned, both made by Michael Harper in tribute to Helen's late son, Daniel. The room erupted in confused chatter. Mayor Jenkins banged his gavel repeatedly. Order, this meeting will maintain order. When the noise subsided, the mayor turned to Helen. Mrs. Whitmore, these are serious implications. Would you care to respond? Helen remained standing, her composure visibly shaken. This is absurd. You're allowing a town meeting about horse ordinances to turn into a witch hunt based on security footage that proves nothing and the supposed testimony of a horse. No one's suggesting legal action based on Storm's reaction to your bracelet, Sheriff Dobson clarified, stepping forward. But it does raise questions about your motivation in targeting these specific horses. My only motivation is concern for a vulnerable child, Helen insisted, though her voice had lost some of its certainty. Emma had been watching the proceedings intently. Now, unexpectedly, she slid from her seat and walked deliberately toward Helen. The room fell silent, all eyes following the small figure as she crossed the aisle. Helen took an involuntary step back as Emma approached. The child stopped directly in front of her, looking up into her face with an expression of quiet intensity. Then slowly and deliberately, Emma reached out and touched the red bracelet on Helen's wrist. The simple gesture held the weight of accusation. Helen's composure crumbled completely. I didn't mean to, she whispered, her voice barely audible in the hushed room. It was raining so hard. I'd had a glass of wine. I ran the red light. I was on the phone. Emma continued to look up at her, silent but expectant. I panicked. Helen continued, tears now streaming down her face. I just drove away. And then when I heard who it was, Michael, who survived when my Daniel didn't, and Sarah, she covered her face with her hands. I couldn't face it, couldn't admit what I'd done. The confession hung in the air, shocking in its suddenness and completeness. Sheriff Dobson moved forward, placing a gentle hand on Helen's shoulder. Helen Whitmore, I need you to come with me to the station to make a formal statement, he said quietly. Helen nodded, defeated. As the sheriff led her toward the door, she paused beside Emma. I'm sorry, she whispered, for everything. Emma didn't respond. She simply watched as Helen was led away, her expression unreadable. In the stunned silence that followed, Mayor Jenkins cleared his throat. In light of these unexpected developments, I suggest we postpone any decision regarding the Harper horses until a later date. No one objected. As the meeting broke up, people filed out in subdued groups, discussing the shocking confession in hushed tones. Walter and Margaret enfolded Emma between them, their faces reflecting the complex emotions of the moment, vindication mingled with renewed grief. Outside, Storm waited at the edge of the town square, his posture alert. As Emma emerged from the town hall, the stallion's ears pricked forward, his gaze fixed on her. It was as if he knew something momentous had occurred. Emma broke away from her grandparents and ran to Storm, wrapping her arms around his powerful neck. The horse lowered his head, enveloping her in a protective embrace. Evelyn, watching from the town hall steps, felt a lump form in her throat. In her years of studying animal-human interactions, she had never witnessed anything quite like the bond between this child and these horses. It transcended conventional understanding, touching something primal and profound. As the sun began to set over Whisper Valley, casting long shadows across the town square, Emma remained with Storm, her small form dwarfed by his powerful presence. Yet in that moment, it was the child who seemed to be providing comfort to the horse rather than the other way around. A circle of healing, Evelyn thought, each giving strength to the other, each finding voice in the other's presence. The path forward was uncertain. Helen's confession would have legal and social repercussions that would ripple through the small community for months to come. But one thing seemed clear: Emma and her horses had crossed a threshold together. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they had faced all others, in silence but never alone. I've now completed part 2 of The Silent Voice, maintaining consistency with the outline and building upon the foundation established in part 1. This section develops the healing journey between Emma and her horses, while unraveling the mystery surrounding Helen Whitmore's opposition to Storm. The confession changed everything and nothing. Helen Whitmore's admission of guilt brought a strange, suspended silence to Whisper Valley. In the days that followed, the town seemed to hold its collective breath, as if uncertain how to process this new reality. The hit-and-run driver responsible for the Harper tragedy had been among them all along, hiding behind concerns for safety and propriety. For Emma, the days continued their familiar rhythm. Dawn still arrived with the horses at the edge of the property. The morning rides still traced their paths through town and along Silver Creek. But something had shifted in the quality of that silence, a weight lifted, a truth acknowledged. Sheriff Dobson had taken Helen's formal statement the evening of the council meeting. The details were even more damning than her public confession had suggested. She had been drinking that night, was distracted by a phone call, and ran a red light, colliding with the Harper vehicle. In her panic and alcohol-impaired judgment, she had fled the scene. The district attorney's office is reviewing the case, Dobson explained to Walter and Margaret 3 days later. They sat at the kitchen table of Eagle Rock Ranch, Emma perched on a stool by the window within earshot, but seemingly focused on the horses grazing in the distance. "Will there be charges?" Walter asked, his weathered hand covering Margaret's. Dobson nodded solemnly. "Vehicular manslaughter leaving the scene of a fatal accident, obstruction of justice. The DA says even with the time that's passed, the evidence is solid, especially with her confession." "Prison," Margaret's voice was barely audible. "Most likely, though given her age and standing in the community, they might consider a plea arrangement." The sheriff glanced toward Emma. "They'll want to keep the trial brief, minimize trauma for everyone involved." Walter's expression was complicated grief and anger, mingled with a weary sort of vindication. All this time she was campaigning against Storm because she was afraid he'd somehow expose her. "Guilt makes people irrational," Dobson said. "From what she told me, every time Storm reacted to that bracelet, she was convinced he was about to reveal everything somehow." "Horses don't forget," Walter murmured, echoing what he'd told Evelyn days earlier. Margaret wiped away a tear. "What happens now, with the horses, I mean? Given the circumstances, the council has unanimously agreed to grant a permanent exception to the acreage ordinance for the Harper horses." Dobson smiled slightly. "Barney Thompson even started a fund to rebuild your fences. Half the town has contributed already." From her perch by the window, Emma continued to watch the horses, seemingly oblivious to the adult conversation. But her shoulders had relaxed slightly at the sheriff's words, a subtle tell that she was absorbing everything. "And Helen?" Walter asked, his voice gruff. "She's under house arrest, pending arraignment. Her lawyer's already talking plea bargain." Dobson hesitated. "She asked to speak with Emma." Margaret straightened, immediately, protective instinct flaring. "Absolutely not." "I agree," Dobson said quickly. "I told her it was inappropriate, but she did write this." He placed a sealed envelope on the table. "Said it was important. I've read it, nothing harmful, just explanations. Apologies." Walter regarded the envelope with suspicion. "We'll decide if Emma sees it." "Of course." Dobson stood to leave. "One more thing. Helen sold her property to the county. Said she wanted the proceeds to go to a trust for Emma's care." This news hung in the air, complex in its implications. Blood money, some might call it, or perhaps the nearest thing to atonement Helen could offer. After the sheriff left Walter and Margaret sat in silence, the envelope between them like a live thing. Finally, Margaret spoke. "What do we do with this?" Walter sighed heavily. "Give it to Emma, I suppose. Let her decide." Margaret's brow furrowed. "She's 7, Walt. 7 going on 70 sometimes." He glanced toward their granddaughter still perched by the window. "She's lived through more than most adults, and she was the one who got Helen to confess without saying a word." Margaret couldn't argue with that. She took the envelope and walked to the window, kneeling beside Emma's stool to bring herself to eye level with the child. "Emma, honey, Sheriff Dobson brought this for you. It's a letter from Mrs. Whitmore." She kept her voice neutral, not wanting to influence Emma's reaction. "You don't have to read it if you don't want to." Emma studied her grandmother's face, then looked at the envelope. After a moment's hesitation, she took it, turning it over in her small hands. She traced the neat handwriting of her name on the front, then set it aside on the windowsill, returning her gaze to the horses outside. Not now, but not never. The decision had been made. Margaret squeezed Emma's shoulder gently, then returned to the table. "I'm not sure if that was a yes or a no," she admitted to Walter. "It was an 'I'll decide when I'm ready,'" he replied, "which is fair enough." Outside, Storm raised his head, looking directly toward the window where Emma sat. The stallion's ears pricked forward, alert and questioning. Emma pressed her palm against the glass, a silent communication passing between them. Some truths needed no words. Dr. Evelyn Shaw sat at her laptop in her room at the inn, organizing her research notes. The events of the past weeks had expanded her study far beyond its original scope. What had begun as an observation of a naturally occurring therapeutic relationship between a traumatized child and a group of horses had evolved into something more complex, a case study in animal intuition, trauma recovery, and the intricate web of human relationships that surrounded both. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Elena Reyes standing in the hallway, looking tired but determined. "Sorry to bother you," Elena said. "Got a minute?" "Of course." Evelyn ushered her in. "Everything okay?" Elena sank into the room's only armchair, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "Storm's gone." "What?" Evelyn set aside her laptop. "What do you mean gone?" "Animal control took him this morning. Helen's lawyer submitted a complaint claiming Storm is a dangerous animal who deliberately charged her last week." Elena's expression was a mixture of anger and disbelief. It's ridiculous, of course. Storm was protecting Emma, as he always does. But because Helen was injured when he knocked her down. "When was this?" Evelyn interrupted. "I haven't heard anything about Helen being injured." "It happened yesterday after you left town to give that lecture in Missoula. Helen violated her house arrest, showed up at Silver Creek during Emma's morning ride." Elena's jaw tightened. "From what I can piece together, she was drunk, confronted Emma, made some kind of scene. Storm intervened, knocked Helen down. She hit her head on a rock." "Is she okay?" "Concussion, some bruising. She'll be fine. But her lawyer's using the incident to paint Storm as a threat to public safety. They've taken him to the county facility pending a hearing." Evelyn processed this information quickly. "Where's Emma now?" "At the ranch with Walter and Margaret. She's—" Elena hesitated. "Well, she's not good. Hasn't left her room since they took Storm. Won't even see the other horses." "This is clearly retaliation," Evelyn said, already reaching for her jacket. "Helen's final attempt to separate Emma from Storm. That's how I see it, but the law sees a horse that injured a person regardless of the circumstances." Elena stood. "I thought you should know. Your research, your testimony about the therapeutic relationship, it might help get Storm back." Evelyn nodded, determination setting in. "I'll need to see Emma first. Then we can strategize." The drive to Eagle Rock Ranch took place in tense silence. As they pulled into the gravel driveway, Evelyn noted the absence of the horses. Usually they would be visible in the south pasture this time of day, but the field stood empty. Margaret met them at the door, her face drawn with worry. "Thank you for coming," she said, leading them inside. "Emma's still in her room, hasn't touched her breakfast." "Where are the other horses?" Evelyn asked. "Willow, Thunder, Dawn, and Dusty are in the barn. They've been agitated since they took Storm. Emma won't see them, won't go near the barn." Margaret twisted her hands anxiously. It's like we've lost all the progress of the past months in a single day. Walter sat at the kitchen table, a stack of papers before him. Been on the phone all morning with lawyers, he explained. County says the hearing's set for next week. Storm stays in custody until then. Can I see Emma? Evelyn asked. Margaret nodded, leading her upstairs to a small bedroom at the end of the hall. She knocked gently. Emma, Dr. Shaw is here to see you. No response came from behind the closed door. Margaret sighed. She might not answer, but you can go in. Evelyn entered the room quietly. It was simply furnished a twin bed with a patchwork quilt, a small desk, bookshelves filled with children's books and horse figurines. Emma sat on the window seat, knees drawn up to her chest, staring out at the empty pasture where Storm should have been grazing. Hey, Evelyn said softly, approaching slowly. I heard what happened. Emma didn't turn or acknowledge her presence. Her profile was still almost mask-like in its immobility. On the seat beside her lay Helen's unopened letter. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, giving Emma space while remaining in her line of sight. I'm going to help get Storm back. Dr. Reyes is helping too, and Sheriff Dobson. Even Barney's involved. Still no response. Emma, I know how important Storm is to you. I've seen the connection you share. It's special, something most people never experience in their entire lives. Emma's gaze remained fixed on the empty pasture, but something flickered across her face, a minute shift in expression that told Evelyn her words were being absorbed. Storm protected you just like he always has. He did nothing wrong, and we're going to make sure everyone knows that. Evelyn leaned forward slightly. But we need your help. This finally drew a reaction. Emma turned her head, looking at Evelyn with questioning eyes. The hearing is next week. They'll be deciding Storm's fate, whether he can come home or... She left the alternative unspoken. Your testimony could make all the difference. Emma's eyes widened in alarm. She gestured to her throat, then shook her head emphatically. I know you don't speak, Evelyn said gently, but there are other ways to testify. You could write what happened, or an idea formed, or you could show them. Emma tilted her head, curiosity tempering her distress. We could take Willow to the hearing. Show the committee how you interact with the horses, how you communicate without words. Evelyn warmed to the concept as she spoke. A demonstration would be more powerful than any verbal testimony. Emma considered this, her expression thoughtful. After a long moment, she nodded once decisively. Good. Evelyn smiled. Now there's something else we need to discuss. The other horses, they need you too. They're confused and upset about Storm being gone. Emma's face clouded again. She shook her head, turning back to the window. I know it's painful, Evelyn persisted, but you're their link to Storm. Their connection to him is through you. By avoiding them, you're cutting that connection. Emma remained still, but Evelyn could see her words had landed. The child's shoulders tensed, then gradually relaxed as she absorbed this perspective. Just think about it, Evelyn suggested, standing to leave. I'll be back tomorrow to start preparing for the hearing. We'll get Storm home, Emma, I promise. As she reached the door, a small sound made her turn back. Emma had slid from the window seat and stood in the center of the room, Helen's letter in her hand. She held it out to Evelyn, her expression resolute. You want me to read it? Evelyn asked. Emma nodded, then pointed to herself and shook her head. She couldn't read it herself, not yet, but she wanted to know what it said. Evelyn accepted the envelope, understanding the trust being placed in her. I'll read it and tell you the important parts. Is that okay? Another nod, more certain this time. I'll come back this afternoon, Evelyn promised. And Emma, Storm is strong. He'll be okay until we can bring him home. The faintest ghost of a smile touched Emma's lips, the first since Storm had been taken. Downstairs, Evelyn outlined her plan to Walter, Margaret, and Elena. We need to approach this strategically. The legal argument will focus on whether Storm poses a genuine threat to public safety. He doesn't, Elena stated firmly. He was protecting Emma from a woman who killed her parents and was violating a court order to stay away from her. Exactly. But we need more than just our word on that. We need evidence. Evelyn tapped the table thoughtfully. Barney mentioned his inn has security cameras covering Silver Creek Trail. If we're lucky, they might have captured the incident. Walter straightened. I'll talk to Barney right away. Good. Elena, can you compile Storm's veterinary records? Anything that documents his temperament, training, health status? It could all be relevant. Elena nodded. I've got detailed records going back 8 years, and I can provide expert testimony about his behavior patterns. Perfect. Margaret will need Emma at the hearing with Willow if possible. A demonstration of their interaction would be powerful evidence. Margaret looked concerned. Emma hasn't left her room since yesterday. Getting her to appear at a formal hearing. She'll do it for Storm, Evelyn said confidently. She already agreed. She understands what's at stake. As they continued strategizing, Evelyn felt the weight of Emma's letter in her pocket. Later, alone in her car, she carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in Helen's precise handwriting. Dear Emma, words cannot undo what I've done. I took your parents from you. I destroyed your childhood. No apology can ever be sufficient for such harm. I want you to understand, though, not to forgive. The truth is both simple and horrible. I was drinking that night. I ran a red light while arguing on the phone. When I hit your parents' car, I panicked and fled. Only later did I learn who had been in that car. The red bracelet your father made for me was a peace offering. Years ago, my son Daniel and your father were best friends. Daniel died in a car accident while your father survived. I blamed Michael for years, though it wasn't his fault. When he married your mother, he tried to mend our relationship by making me a bracelet identical to the one Daniel had made for them both as teenagers. I wore it that night of the accident. I believe Storm saw it in the headlights. That's why he reacts to it, he remembers. Horses don't forget, and they understand more than we give them credit for. My campaign against the horses, especially Storm, was born of fear and guilt. I convinced myself they were dangerous to you, when in truth I was afraid Storm would somehow expose me. Irrational, I know, but guilt distorts everything. I've instructed my lawyer to sell my house and property. The proceeds will go into a trust for your care and education. It's not compensation, nothing could be, but it's what I can offer. I hope someday you'll speak again. Your voice matters. Your parents would want you to find it. With deepest regret, Helen Whitmore. Evelyn refolded the letter, her throat tight with emotion. The confession was complete, the remorse seemingly genuine. But it couldn't undo the damage done or restore what Emma had lost. Still, there was something valuable here: context, understanding, and most importantly, confirmation of Storm's role as witness. The letter would be powerful evidence at the hearing if Emma allowed it to be shared. With renewed determination, Evelyn drove to meet Barney Thompson. They had a horse to save and a child's healing to protect. The county animal control facility was a low utilitarian building on the outskirts of Missoula. Inside, the walls were institutional green, the fluorescent lighting harsh. Sheriff Dobson flashed his badge at the receptionist. Here to check on the stallion brought in yesterday, Storm. The young woman consulted her computer. He's in the large animal paddock at the back. Dr. Miller is examining him now. Dobson nodded his thanks, gesturing for Evelyn to follow him through the double doors. They emerged into a concrete courtyard surrounded by pens and paddocks of various sizes. In the largest enclosure, a tall man in a lab coat stood beside Storm, making notes on a clipboard. The stallion looked out of place in the sterile facility, his wild beauty constrained by chain-link fencing and concrete. Yet he maintained his dignity, head high, eyes alert. When he spotted Dobson and Evelyn, his ears pricked forward in recognition. "Dr. Miller," Dobson called. "Got a minute?" The veterinarian looked up, securing his pen in his coat pocket before approaching the fence. "Sheriff, what brings you all the way from Whisper Valley?" "Checking on our guest here." Dobson nodded toward Storm. "This is Dr. Evelyn Shaw, equine behavior specialist. She's been working with the Harper case." Dr. Miller shook Evelyn's hand. "The mute girl with the horses heard about that. Remarkable case. How's Storm doing?" Evelyn asked, her gaze on the stallion, who had moved closer to the fence, watching them intently. "Physically, he's fine. No injuries from the restraint or transport. Good muscle tone, healthy coat, excellent teeth. Someone's taken very good care of him." Dr. Miller glanced at his clipboard. "Behaviorally, he's been agitated but not aggressive. Refuses to eat unless alone paces. The enclosure watches the entrance constantly." "He's waiting for Emma," Evelyn explained. "They've never been separated before." Dr. Miller nodded thoughtfully. "I've noted that he shows no signs of aggression toward staff despite his obvious distress. That's significant for the hearing. Many horses would lash out under similar stress." "So you don't consider him dangerous?" Dobson asked. "Based on my observations, no. He's intelligent, watchful, and remarkably controlled given the circumstances. Dr. Miller's expression became more serious. But I'm not the one making the final decision. The committee will consider all evidence, including the incident with Mrs. Whitmore. About that, Evelyn said, we have reason to believe the incident was provoked. Mrs. Whitmore violated her house arrest to confront Emma, despite a court order to stay away from her. Dr. Miller raised an eyebrow. That would certainly change the context. Do you have evidence? Working on it, Dobson replied. Barney Thompson's reviewing his security footage. His cameras cover part of Silver Creek Trail where the incident occurred. Well, I hope you find something conclusive. Otherwise, Dr. Miller left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. Without evidence, Storm's fate would be uncertain at best. They thanked the veterinarian and prepared to leave. At the gate, Evelyn paused, looking back at Storm. The stallion stood at the fence watching her, his dark eyes intelligent and questioning. We'll bring her to see you, she promised quietly, and we'll get you home. Storm nickered softly as if acknowledging her words. As they walked back to the parking lot, Dobson shook his head in wonder. I've been around horses all my life, but I've never seen one like him. It's almost like he understands everything we're saying. I think he does in his way, Evelyn replied. The connection between Storm and Emma goes beyond normal animal-human bonds. They communicate on a level most of us can't access or comprehend. Will that be enough to save him? Evelyn's expression hardened with resolve. It has to be, for both their sakes. The news broke late that afternoon. Barney Thompson had found footage of the incident at Silver Creek. The images were grainy but clear enough to show Helen approaching Emma, aggressively, gesturing wildly, her body language threatening. Storm's intervention came only after Helen grabbed Emma's arm, attempting to pull her from Willow's back. It's self-defense, pure and simple, Sheriff Dobson declared as they reviewed the footage in his office. Storm was protecting Emma from a perceived threat and a real one given Helen's history. Evelyn studied the sequence frame by frame. The way he positions himself between them, the warning signs before he actually makes contact. This is textbook protective behavior, not aggression. He gave Helen multiple opportunities to back off. Will it be enough for the committee? Elena asked, her concern evident. It should be, Dobson replied. Combined with Dr. Miller's assessment and your expert testimonies, it makes a compelling case. There's something else, Evelyn said, reaching into her bag. Helen's letter to Emma. She gave me permission to read it, and I think it should be submitted as evidence. The others read the letter in silence, its revelations landing heavily, despite what they already knew. She admits everything, Margaret whispered, hand over her mouth. The drinking, the phone call, running the red light. And she confirms Storm's reaction to the bracelet, Evelyn pointed out. She acknowledges he recognizes it from the night of the accident. Walter looked up from the letter, his expression grim. Will Emma allow this to be shared at the hearing? I need to ask her, Evelyn admitted, but I think she will. She wants Storm back more than she wants to protect Helen's secrets. The next few days passed in a flurry of preparation. Barney's footage was submitted to the committee along with Dr. Miller's assessment, Elena's veterinary records, and statements from various townspeople attesting to Storm's gentle nature. Helen, from her hospital room where she was recovering from her concussion, instructed her lawyer to withdraw the complaint against Storm. But the damage had been done. Once filed, the dangerous animal complaint had to proceed through the formal hearing process. The committee, composed of a county judge, 2 veterinarians, and 2 citizen representatives, would review all evidence before making their decision. The day before the hearing, Evelyn visited Emma at Eagle Rock Ranch. The child had emerged from her isolation in the days since Storm's removal, reconnecting with the other horses as Evelyn had suggested. Now she spent hours in the barn with Willow Thunderdawn and Dusty, her silent presence seeming to calm their distress over Storm's absence. Evelyn found her in the barn brushing Willow's coat with slow, methodical strokes. The mare stood perfectly still, occasionally turning her head to nuzzle Emma's shoulder. They're ready for us tomorrow, Evelyn said, leaning against the stall door. Barney's footage helps a lot. So does Dr. Miller's assessment. Emma paused in her brushing, looking at Evelyn expectantly. Helen's withdrawn the complaint, but the hearing still has to happen. Evelyn moved closer, kneeling to Emma's eye level. I wanted to ask you about the letter. Would you be okay with us sharing it with the committee? It helps explain why Storm reacted to Helen the way he did. Emma considered this for a long moment, her brush hovering above Willow's coat. Then she nodded, her expression resolute. Thank you. That will help. Evelyn smiled encouragingly. Are you ready for tomorrow? It might be scary, lots of people asking questions. Emma resumed, brushing her focus, returning to Willow. But after a few strokes, she paused again. Setting the brush aside, she turned fully to face Evelyn. Her small hands rose to her throat, then moved outward in a flowing gesture. Your voice, Evelyn guessed. Emma nodded, then pointed to the hearing notes in Evelyn's hand. You want to speak at the hearing? Evelyn asked, careful to keep her surprise from showing. Emma's response was a single determined nod. Emma, that would be powerful, but only if you're ready. No one expects you to speak if you're not. The child's expression remained unchanged, resolute, certain. Whatever decision she had reached, it appeared final. Evelyn didn't push further. Okay, we'll be ready either way. The most important thing is bringing Storm home. As she left the barn, Evelyn found Walter waiting outside, his weathered face creased with concern. She okay? He asked, nodding toward the barn. She's preparing in her own way, Evelyn replied. She agreed to let us use Helen's letter as evidence. Walter nodded, relief evident in his posture. That's good. That's real good. There's something else, Evelyn said carefully. She indicated she might want to speak at the hearing. Walter's eyebrows shot up. Speak as in talk. Use her voice. That's what she seemed to be saying. I didn't want to make too much of it in case she changes her mind or can't do it when the moment comes. Walter sighed heavily. Been 3 months without a word. Hard to imagine her breaking that silence now, especially in front of strangers. Trauma works in mysterious ways, Evelyn said. Sometimes a new crisis can break through barriers the original trauma created. Storm being taken might be the catalyst she needed. Maybe. Walter didn't sound convinced. Just don't want her disappointed if it doesn't happen the way she hopes. Of course, we'll be prepared either way. As Evelyn drove back to the inn, her mind was filled with possibilities. The idea of Emma speaking after months of silence was both thrilling and concerning. Such a breakthrough would be significant for her healing process, but the pressure of a public hearing was far from ideal circumstances. Tomorrow would reveal what Emma was truly ready for. All they could do was create the space for her voice, whatever form it took to be heard. The county courthouse was an imposing building of red brick and white columns. Inside the hearing room was arranged more like a conference room than a courtroom, a large oval table where the committee members sat with chairs arranged in rows before them for witnesses and observers. Emma sat between Walter and Margaret in the front row, her small frame almost swallowed by the large wooden chair. She wore a blue dress Margaret had ironed that morning, her dark hair neatly braided. Her expression was solemn but composed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Willow had been brought to the courthouse as planned, secured in a temporary paddock set up in the side yard. The committee had agreed to Emma's demonstration as part of the evidence presentation. The hearing began with formal introductions. Judge Martha Reynolds, serving as committee chair, outlined the purpose of the proceedings. We are here to determine whether the stallion known as Storm constitutes a danger to public safety, following an incident involving Mrs. Helen Whitmore. Her tone was neutral professional. We will hear testimony from various witnesses, review submitted evidence, and observe a demonstration of the animal's behavior before reaching our decision. Sheriff Dobson testified, first presenting Barney's security footage and explaining the circumstances surrounding Helen's confrontation with Emma. Mrs. Whitmore was under house arrest for vehicular manslaughter and leaving the scene of a fatal accident, the very accident that killed Emma Harper's parents, he explained. She violated that order to confront Emma during her morning ride. The footage clearly shows she initiated physical contact before Storm intervened. Dr. Miller followed, presenting his professional assessment of Storm during the stallion's confinement. I've observed no aggressive tendencies despite the stress of separation and confinement, he stated. The animal demonstrates remarkable self-control and intelligence. His protective behavior toward Emma Harper is consistent with established bonding patterns in horses, particularly those with specialized training. Elena provided Storm's complete medical and behavioral history, while Evelyn offered her professional analysis of the therapeutic relationship between Emma and the horses. What we're witnessing is an exceptional case of naturally occurring equine therapy, Evelyn explained. Storm and the other horses have effectively created a therapeutic environment that has been crucial to Emma's recovery following the trauma of losing her parents. Separating them now would be detrimental to her healing process. Finally, Helen's letter was submitted and read aloud its contents, creating a ripple of murmurs through the hearing room. The connection between the red bracelet the night of the accident and Storm's protective behavior was now clear to everyone present. Throughout the testimony, Emma sat perfectly still, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance. Only the occasional tightening of her hands in her lap betrayed her tension. "Thank you for these presentations," Judge Reynolds said when the testimonies concluded. "We would now like to observe the demonstration with Emma and Willow, after which the committee will deliberate." The proceedings moved outside to the temporary paddock. Willow stood patiently in the center, her gray coat gleaming in the autumn sunlight. As Emma approached the fence, the mare's ears pricked forward, a soft nicker of greeting escaping her. Emma entered the paddock alone, the adults remaining outside to observe. Without hesitation, she walked directly to Willow, who lowered her head to the child's level. For a moment, they simply stood together, foreheads almost touching in a greeting that spoke of deep connection. Then Emma began to move around the paddock using subtle hand gestures and body positioning to direct Willow. The mare responded instantly to each silent command, walking, stopping, turning, backing up. It was a dance of mutual understanding, performed without a single word or audible cue. "Remarkable," one of the veterinarians on the committee murmured. "The horse is reading her body language perfectly." "It's more than that," Evelyn said quietly. "They're communicating on multiple levels: breath patterns, micro-expressions, pressure and release. Emma doesn't need words to make herself understood." After several minutes of demonstration, Judge Reynolds called for Emma to return. The child guided Willow to the gate, where Walter waited to secure the mare. But instead of exiting the paddock, Emma turned to face the committee directly. A hush fell over the observers. Emma stood very still, her small figure framed by the paddock fence, Willow a solid presence behind her. She took a deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling. Then, to everyone's astonishment, she spoke. "He knew." The words were soft, slightly raspy from disuse, but clear enough to be heard by everyone present. A collective intake of breath rippled through the audience. "He knew before I did." Emma continued, her voice growing slightly stronger with each word, "that my heart was still here." Walter made a choked sound, his hand gripping the fence post for support. Margaret pressed her fingers to her lips, tears streaming freely down her face. Emma turned to look at Willow, then back to the committee. "Storm protects because he loves. He saw what happened that night. He remembers." Her voice broke slightly on the last word, emotion threatening to overwhelm her. But she pushed through. "Please bring him home. We need him." For a moment, no one moved or spoke. The simple words delivered in that small, determined voice after months of silence held more power than the most eloquent testimony. Judge Reynolds was the first to recover. "Thank you, Emma," she said, her professional demeanor briefly giving way to genuine emotion. "Your statement will be considered in our deliberation." The committee withdrew to a private room while the others waited in the courthouse lobby. Emma sat between her grandparents, exhausted by the effort of breaking her silence, but visibly relieved, as if a great weight had been lifted. "You did it," Walter whispered, his arm around her shoulders. "You found your voice when it mattered most." Emma leaned against him, accepting the comfort, but offering no more words. She had said what needed to be said. Now they could only wait. The deliberation was brief. Within 30 minutes, the committee returned and everyone filed back into the hearing room. Judge Reynolds addressed the assembly. "After reviewing all evidence and testimony, including Emma Harper's powerful statement, this committee has reached a unanimous decision regarding the stallion known as Storm." She paused, glancing down at her notes before continuing. "We find that Storm does not constitute a danger to public safety. His actions during the incident with Mrs. Whitmore were protective, not aggressive, and were precipitated by a clear threat to his primary caregiver. Furthermore, we recognize the significant therapeutic benefit he provides to Emma Harper." A wave of relief swept through the room. Margaret squeezed Emma's hand, tears in her eyes. "Therefore," Judge Reynolds continued, We order Storm's immediate release from county custody and his return to Eagle Rock Ranch with the following conditions. First, the permanent fencing proposed by the Community Fund must be completed within 60 days. Second, Storm must continue to wear the tracking device during any off-property excursions for an additional 6 months. She looked directly at Emma. These conditions are not punitive, but precautionary, ensuring both Storm's safety and that of the community. Does the Harper family accept these terms? Walter stood. We do, Your Honor, and we're grateful. Then this hearing is concluded. Arrangements will be made for Storm's transport back to Eagle Rock Ranch today. As the room erupted in relieved conversation, Emma remained seated, her expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. She had won Storm's freedom, found her voice when it mattered most, but the journey wasn't over. In some ways, it was just beginning. The reunion took place at sunset. Storm arrived in a county transport trailer escorted by Sheriff Dobson and Dr. Miller. The stallion emerged cautiously, nostrils flaring, as he took in his surroundings. When he spotted Emma waiting by the barn, his entire demeanor changed. Head high, ears forward, he moved toward her with purpose. Emma met him halfway, her small arms reaching up to encircle his powerful neck. The stallion lowered his head, enveloping her in an embrace that transcended species barriers. Around them, the other horses formed a protective circle. Willow, Thunder, Dawn, and Dusty each touching noses, with Storm in greeting. Home, Emma whispered the word meant for Storm alone. Walter, Margaret, Elena, and Evelyn watched from a respectful distance, giving horse and child the space their reunion deserved. I've never seen anything like it, Dr. Miller murmured. It's like they're having a conversation we can't hear. They are, Evelyn replied simply. We just don't have the vocabulary to understand it. As darkness fell, the observers gradually dispersed. Elena and Dr. Miller returned to town, promising to check in the next day. Sheriff Dobson lingered until Walter insisted he'd call if anything was needed. Finally, only Evelyn remained, her research notes forgotten in the face of the moment unfolding before her. Emma had moved with Storm and the other horses to the south pasture, where they formed a circle around her, their bodies creating a living barrier between the child and the outside world. Margaret approached, offering Evelyn a steaming mug of tea. Will you stay for dinner? It's the least we can do after everything. Thank you, but I should head back to the inn. My flight leaves tomorrow morning. Evelyn accepted the tea, gratefully warming her hands around the mug. My research here is complete, at least for now. Nuss. Margaret glanced toward the pasture where Emma sat cross-legged in the grass, Storm standing sentinel beside her. What happens next for Emma, I mean? That's up to her, Evelyn said. She's broken through a significant barrier by speaking today. But healing isn't linear. There may be setbacks, periods of silence again. But she can speak. She did speak. Yes. And now she knows she can when it matters enough. Evelyn smiled gently. The horses will continue to be her bridge to the world. Storm especially. They understand each other in ways that transcend normal communication. Walter joined them, his weathered face relaxed for the first time in weeks. Helen's sentencing is next month, he said quietly. Her lawyer called. She's pleading guilty to all charges. Will Emma need to be there? Evelyn asked. Walter shook his head. Judge says her written statement is enough. She wrote it this afternoon after we got home. First thing she's written that wasn't just a few words. May I ask what it said? Walter's expression softened. It was simple, direct. She wrote, I forgive you for the accident. I can't forgive you for trying to take Storm away, but I hope you find peace. Evelyn nodded, understanding the wisdom in those few sentences. She's an extraordinary child. She is, Margaret agreed. And thanks to you and Storm, she's finding her way back to us. They stood in companionable silence, watching as darkness settled fully over Eagle Rock Ranch. In the pasture, Emma had fallen asleep, curled against Storm's side. The other horses maintained their protective circle, their silhouettes barely visible in the gathering night. Should we bring her in? Margaret wondered aloud. Walter shook his head. Let her be. Storm will keep her warm. She's where she needs to be right now. Evelyn said her goodbyes, promising to stay in touch and to return for follow-up research in the spring. As she drove away from Eagle Rock Ranch for the last time, she glanced in her rearview mirror. The ranch house glowed warmly in the darkness, a beacon of light against the vast Montana night. Some distances, Evelyn reflected, could only be bridged by understanding that went beyond words. Emma and Storm had taught her that a lesson is valuable as any research finding. Spring came to Whisper Valley in a rush of green and gold. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows and Silver Creek ran high with snowmelt from the mountains. At Eagle Rock Ranch, the new fencing gleamed white against the awakening landscape, enclosing expanded pastures where the horses grazed contentedly. The morning rides continued, though their route had evolved. Emma now led the procession through town each dawn, but instead of continuing alone to Silver Creek, she was often joined by other children, some from Whisper Valley, others who traveled from neighboring communities with their parents. The story of Emma and Storm had spread throughout the region, drawing families seeking help for children with trauma, autism, or communication challenges. What had begun as a personal healing journey had evolved into something larger, an informal therapeutic program that Elena and Evelyn, who returned monthly to continue her research, helped structure and supervise. Helen Whitmore had been sentenced to 5 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 3. As promised, she had sold her property, the proceeds establishing the Whisper Hooves Trust Fund, which now supported the therapeutic riding program operating on the expanded Harper property. Emma's speech had returned gradually over the winter months. She still preferred silence much of the time, speaking only when necessary, and often choosing to communicate through writing or the silent language she shared with the horses. But when she did speak, her words carried the weight of careful consideration. On a warm morning in late May, the town gathered at Silver Creek Bridge for the first annual Mustang Day celebration. Colorful banners decorated the bridge where Storm had once saved Emma from drowning. Children and adults alike wore flower garlands, and the atmosphere was festive. Emma led the procession, as always, but today she rode Storm rather than Willow. The big stallion moved with dignified purpose, his tracking device removed months ago when the probationary period ended. Behind them came a dozen other children on various horses, some from the original Harper herd, others donated to the growing program. At the center of the bridge, Emma halted the procession. Storm stood perfectly still as she rose to stand on his back, balanced with the confidence of long practice. The crowd fell silent, waiting. A year ago, Emma began, her voice clear and carrying across the water. I couldn't speak. I couldn't feel. I was lost. She gestured to the horses and children behind her. Storm found me. He spoke without words. He taught me to trust again. From the crowd, Walter and Margaret watched with tears in their eyes. Beside them stood Elena, Barney, Sheriff Dobson, and Evelyn, who had returned for the celebration. Now we're helping others find their voices, Emma continued. Some speak with words, some with their hands, some with their hearts. All are heard. She settled back onto Storm's back, her hand resting on his powerful neck. We never needed words, she said softly, though her voice carried in the hush. Only trust. As if on cue, Storm raised his head and released a powerful neigh that echoed across the valley. The other horses answered their voices, blending in a chorus that needed no translation. Emma smiled, a full, unreserved expression of joy that transformed her solemn face. Then she guided Storm forward, leading the procession across the bridge and into the future that awaited on the other side. Behind them, Whisper Valley stood bathed in morning light, a community transformed by a child's silence and a horse's understanding. And somewhere, perhaps, Sarah and Michael Harper watched over their daughter as she carried their legacy forward, teaching others that sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that speak without words. Trust, presence, connection. These were the gifts Storm had given Emma in her darkest hours. Now together they offered those same gifts to others who needed them. The circle of healing continued expanding outward, like ripples on the surface of Silver Creek, touching lives beyond counting or measure. And at its center rode a girl and her horse, their bond transcending the barriers of species and speech, reminding all who witnessed it that sometimes the deepest truths require no words at all. The morning light catches on the flower garlands as Emma stands tall on Storm's back, her voice carrying across the water. We never needed words, only trust. Some journeys don't end when we find what was lost. They transform, becoming bridges for others to cross. In the year since Storm saved Emma, and Emma saved Storm, Whisper Valley has changed. A town once divided now gathers at Silver Creek Bridge, watching children who were once lost find their way back through the patient presence of horses who understand what it means to listen without ears and speak without words. We live in a world of noise, of explanations and justifications, of words used to build walls rather than bridges. But what if our most profound connections happen in the spaces between words? What truth might a horse know that we've forgotten how to hear? Perhaps in your own life, there's someone who sees you as clearly as Storm saw Emma. Someone who stands beside you in your silence, patient and unwavering. Or perhaps you are that someone for another soul whose voice has been stolen by grief or fear. In the end, healing isn't about finding the right words. It's about finding the courage to trust again, to stand in the dawn light, to let yourself be seen. The most powerful voice is sometimes the one that speaks without sound, in the language of presence, of unwavering loyalty, of love that asks for nothing in return.